He was merely another member of the subjugation squad. Poor soldiers sent to war simply to support the true heroes. They were nothing more than disposable pawns. Even after intense training, would that really be enough? Even so, none of it compared to the enemy capable of bringing humanity to its end. Among those soldiers was Gray Lee. Gray Lee eventually found himself face to face with that terrifying creature. It was then that something dormant within him finally awakened. With a new opportunity, perhaps he could save the world, or he might end up succumbing to his own power. After all, that power was so dangerous that using it even once could destroy him. Want to find out just how far this story will go? Editor, bring in the wind. Until the swordsman had finally arrived at the scene alongside his allies. If they could defeat that creature amid the chaos of war. However, he suffered a fatal wound after a laser struck him directly through the heart. In the end, he would die there without managing to do anything at all. One day, an unknown threat appeared and suddenly destroyed an entire continent. The creature that struck him was known as the Liquidator. He was humanity's archenemy. To confront him, a special group of heroes had been assembled. Among them was Brian Miller, a man who survived the impact of a gigantic meteorite unscathed and became known as the shield protecting the world. There was also Bella Albright, a great sage whose power was said to equal that of an entire division. Jacob Bloomfield, the archer famous for bringing down a dragon with a single shot. And Amy White, regarded as the most powerful swordswoman in history and known as the Sword Saint. Besides them, there was also a unit responsible for providing support. Gray Lee, who had just fallen, was nothing more than an ordinary soldier from that unit. They were merely artificial pawns sent out as sacrifices. The others, the true heroes, existed on an entirely different level. Gray knew that those trained at the World Union Academy were extraordinary. Even so, he had never imagined the difference would be so vast. Perhaps the support unit's presence made no difference at all. They had all trained hard, but their abilities were far below that level. At that moment, Amy White finally managed to strike the Liquidator, leaving only a small mark. That was when he stopped playing around. With a single sweeping laser, he brought down every hero. The weapons that remained intact fell to the ground. The entire group had been defeated with a single attack. Gray Lee knew defeating that creature was practically impossible. Yet at that moment, he noticed something strange. He was still alive. His heart had been pierced some time ago, yet for some reason, he was still breathing. Then someone found Gray Lee lying in his own blood and offered him the opportunity to wield immense power. Suddenly, he found himself somewhere else, a place resembling an abandoned temple beneath the vastness of the cosmos. Before him appeared an intimidating creature that looked nothing like a human. The being claimed that Gray Lee had not died yet. His physical wounds had vanished. Gray asked whether the creature had healed him, but learned that the recovery came from his own power, something the being still could not explain. Not even that creature could properly analyze this power. Even so, it assured Gray that he could surpass the Liquidator if he learned to control it. Gray then asked whether they could win the war. The being replied that there was practically no hope. Even so, it believed the Liquidator had to be eliminated no matter what. Soon afterward, it caused Gray Lee to lose his life once again. Then it told Gray that he could leave, and that it would lend him a small portion of its power. Gray Lee rose again on the battlefield, wielding a sword forged from shadows. That was his own power, while the strength lent by the mysterious being remained invisible to the eye. Without hesitation, Gray charged at the Liquidator. The creature seemed surprised that such a powerful human was still standing. And to everyone's surprise, Gray Lee's attack actually managed to inflict some damage. However, Gray had yet to master that power and had severely underestimated the Liquidator. Once again, he fell. This time, his body was split in half, yet what remained of him remained standing, sustained by the power of the shadows. His appearance was already far from human. It was as though he had been consumed by... The strike from his shadow sword managed to split the Liquidator, but at that very instant, the creature retaliated. The Liquidator also decided to unleash the true extent of his power. Earth's time seemed to have reached its end. In an instant, everything was plunged into the darkness of night. Gray Lee, however, showed no concern and simply kept attacking relentlessly until a barrier appeared and protected the creature from his sword. The Liquidator declared that all his effort was useless. Within the plane of true twilight, nothing could harm him. When Gray Lee raised his eyes toward the stars, he was struck by their beauty. However, those stars were plummeting toward Earth. When the Liquidator went to see whether the human had finally fallen, he found the symbol of Kronos. Kronos was the one helping the human return, using every bit of strength he still possessed. Kronos was sending Gray Lee back so that he could defeat the Liquidator. In doing so, he entrusted him with all his hope and the fate of that world. Sometime later, Gray opened his eyes near his homeland. That place had been destroyed 15 years earlier. Faced with this, he began wondering whether he had truly traveled back in time. He realized that his frail body was still injured. Back then, some boys from the village constantly bullied him. He refused to submit to them, but they were all much stronger at the time. Back then, defeating the Liquidator was nothing more than a dream. He would figure out how to deal with those people once he became stronger, since he had no desire to get hurt again. However, while returning to the village through the forest, he unexpectedly ran into someone. It was Belder, the bully. He had been looking for Gray Lee because of everything the boy had put him through. Belder handed him a sword and proposed a practice duel to make things fair. Gray Lee replied that he had not fully recovered from his injury yet and politely declined. Belder, however, told him not to worry, since the blade was dull and posed no danger. Gray Lee replied that even so, it was still dangerous. Belder told him to shut up, claiming he had no right to refuse. If he did not like swords, he could fight barehanded instead. Then he charged at him. Gray Lee realized that Belder genuinely intended to fight him while he was unarmed. That supposed practice match had already lost any meaning. Before returning, a former military doctor had explained why his swordsmanship had never developed as it should have. It all stemmed from an injury he had suffered during childhood. Perhaps that had been the very point where his path of defeats began. However, when Belder approached, Gray Lee dodged the attack with surprising ease. To him, the attack seemed incredibly slow. He could follow every movement without the slightest difficulty. His movements were much faster now. The boys around him remarked that he seemed like a completely different person. Gray Lee no longer had the same body as before, but he retained every memory of the battles he had fought. When Belder charged again, he knew exactly how to respond. Once again, Gray Lee disarmed him. The maneuver threw Belder so badly off balance that the sword slipped from his hand. Gray Lee remarked that Belder had probably never trained to take a sword strike. Even so, there was no reason to worry. After all, they themselves had said that the blade was dull. By that logic, striking someone with it should be perfectly safe. Even so, Gray Lee's next strike ended up injuring Belder. Gray Lee himself was surprised to see that the blade truly was dull. Had it been sharp, the outcome could have been far more serious. He then seized the opening and struck Belder on the nose with the flat of the sword. Gray Lee approached and asked why he was making such a fuss. After all, Belder himself had insisted that the sword was dull. Irritated, the bully demanded to know why the others were still standing around doing nothing. Naturally, they tried to surround Gray Lee. At first, he considered simply ignoring them. However, he eventually accepted that second round of confrontation. Sometime later, all the bullies were lying on the ground, aching badly. Gray Lee had once been terrified of those boys, but now dealing with them seemed far too easy. He then asked whether they all belonged to the swordsman's dojo. They confirmed that they did, and until then, they had believed themselves to be quite strong. Gray Lee knew he should not expect much from that dojo, but perhaps he could still gain something from it. So he asked them to introduce him there through a referral. The boys did not want to return to the dojo in that condition after being defeated. Gray Lee replied that if they did not want to accompany him, they could simply go back to what they had been doing earlier. With little choice, Belder eventually led Gray Lee back to the dojo. On the way, Belder asked why he wanted to visit the dojo. Gray Lee explained that he was seeking a recommendation to secure a place at the academy. One of the boys remarked that Gray Lee already seemed strong enough and did not even need to attend the academy. Gray Lee replied that he was still far from being able to consider himself truly strong. He remembered that not even the greatest elite group in the world had been able to fight the Liquidator on equal terms. Even using that power, he had barely managed to affect the Liquidator once his opponent fought seriously. Gray Lee had no idea how strong he needed to become to defeat him, so he decided to start over from the basics. At that moment, he briefly sensed that dark power once again. His attention shifted to the technique he had learned from the Sword Saint. If he had received more training under the same conditions as she had, perhaps the outcome of that confrontation would have been different. That was precisely why Kronos had sent him back into the past. When the group returned to the dojo, Saria, the instructor, immediately asked whether they had used the techniques learned there against a civilian. To make matters worse, they had apparently ended up being defeated by that very same civilian. Belder tried to justify himself, saying that they had not intended to attack him and that it had only been training. Before he could finish his excuse, however, Saria sent him flying across the dojo with a strike from her staff. She had no interest in excuses. To Saria, attacking someone who was unarmed could never be called training. She then ordered all of them to leave the dojo and never show their faces there again. Afterward, Saria apologized to Gray Lee for the trouble caused by her former students. She also learned that he had come there seeking a recommendation for the academy. As compensation, she agreed to consider his request. Before writing the recommendation, however, she needed to evaluate his abilities. The two of them then picked up wooden swords. Gray Lee took the initiative. Saria stepped back and blocked his attacks while carefully observing his style. As she studied the boy's movements, she realized that his swordsmanship was remarkably practical for someone his age, as though he already had experience in real battles. It became clear why Belder and the others had been unable to handle him. His style seemed almost self-taught and still lacked refinement, but his talent was undeniable. Gray Lee was truly a diamond in the rough. Saria increased the pressure with stronger attacks, but Gray Lee held his ground and refused to retreat. He was able to keep up with the force of her attacks. Saria had only intended to evaluate the boy, yet she realized that she was beginning to fight far more seriously. The instructor was surprised by Gray Lee. Suddenly, he unleashed an unexpected strike infused with a dark force. force. The presence of that power made Surya instinctively retreat. When Grey Lee faltered for a moment, she noticed an opening in his defense and attacked. To her surprise, however, it was Surya's sword that ended up breaking. Grey Lee stood frozen in complete surprise before dropping to his knees. His current body simply could not withstand the intensity of that dark power. He could barely remain standing. It was clear that he should not resort to that power so recklessly. Grey Lee considered telling the instructor everything, but decided it would be better to keep it secret. Even if he explained, she probably would not believe him. Something even he can't control, and he told her that he had gotten a little carried away. After examining the broken sword, Surya concluded that, logically, it should have been impossible to break her blade with a dull wooden sword. Surya was certain the boy knew that, but pretended not to notice. After all, she was the one who could provide him with a letter of recommendation for the Royal Swordsmanship Academy. Even so, she couldn't recommend that Grey Lee go there. He still wasn't ready for that place. He himself knew he wasn't strong enough yet, especially since he could barely control his own power. However, the instructor said that he should actually try to enter the Unified World Academy. It wasn't merely the best in the kingdom, but the finest in the entire world. The Sword Saintess and other saviors of humanity had graduated from there. Surya made it clear that he was still far from that level. Grey Lee himself had already realized that, since his body still wasn't ready, his physique wasn't even properly conditioned for a swordsman. At the Royal Academy, he could compensate with skill, but the World Academy was different. Everyone there was extraordinary, and with his current body, he would struggle to compete. Even so, Surya said there was no reason to give up. 9 months remained until the entrance exam, which was enough time for him to prepare. She asked him to try and trust her. For the next 9 months, his training would be extremely difficult, and that was exactly what Grey Lee wanted. He asked her to oversee his training for those 9 months. Surya admired his determination and began the grueling routine. Over the following days, he trained by lifting rocks and consuming protein, along with whatever strange concoctions Surya prepared. He also practiced swordsmanship and worked on his endurance, agility, and reflexes. 8 months later, his body had become far stronger, more muscular, and well-conditioned. Surya said she had already taught him everything she could. Now Grey Lee only needed to leave and trust himself. There was still 1 month before the entrance exam. Since he would be taking the test in an unfamiliar place, it would be better to arrive early. She even offered him money to cover lodging, food, and other expenses. Grey Lee replied that she had already helped him too much and he couldn't accept it. It almost seemed as though she were trying to send him away. He had also heard rumors that an ogre nest had been discovered nearby, and the situation didn't sound peaceful at all. Surya pretended not to know anything about it and said it wasn't their problem. Help would come from the capital, so he should continue his journey without worrying. Grey Lee, however, knew she was lying. No reinforcements would reach the village, and shortly before its destruction, Surya would lose her life. According to what he knew, she would die while trying to face the ogres alone. So Grey Lee accepted the pouch and said he would leave. Surya wished him success on the exam. Except, that night, after putting the boy's mind at ease, she headed into the forest. Surya set out to hunt the ogre, but Grey Lee managed to catch her by surprise. He appeared in the middle of the road and asked where she was going, master. She couldn't understand why he still wasn't on his way to the academy. Grey Lee replied that he thought the capital was supposed to handle the ogre, not his own master. Surya tried to explain that the reinforcements had encountered an emergency, but assured him she could handle it alone. From the scout's report, she knew the nest's strength, and its leader was an elite ogre. The nest contained around 45 monsters, a difficult number for Surya to face alone. Grey Lee knew that an elite ogre by itself wasn't particularly dangerous, since its true strength lay in intelligence and leadership. To Grey Lee, letting her go alone was far too risky. Surya wouldn't survive, and the village would eventually be destroyed because he had already witnessed that future. For that reason, he asked to accompany her. He also didn't want to waste such a rare opportunity to gain experience in a real battle. She replied that battles always brought unforeseen circumstances, especially when dealing with a newly formed monster nest. In her opinion, Grey Lee needed much more experience before getting involved in danger of that magnitude. He asked whether she truly insisted on going alone. In that case, Grey Lee already had a solution. He would fight her, knock her unconscious, and then deal with the ogre problem himself. Surya eventually gave in, but imposed one condition. No matter what happened, he had to come back alive. With that, the two of them set out together to eliminate the monster threat. They reached the entrance of a valley where the elite ogre's camp was located. Surrounded on all sides, the place had only one exit. Grey Lee realized that entering would also make retreat difficult. Surya then instructed Grey Lee to eliminate the visible enemies on his side. Meanwhile, she would advance from the other direction while searching for the leader. The two moved at the same time, and the guards patrolling the area barely had time to notice the two approaching. They were quickly neutralized. As soon as one of them managed to alert the others, the ogres unleashed their war cry and charged into battle. What followed was a complete defeat for the monsters. In truth, everything turned out to be far easier than they had expected. Surya was surprised to think that this was his first battle against ogres. In reality, it was only his first time in this life. What truly caught Grey Lee's attention was how weak those ogres seemed. Surya could have survived even if she had come alone. However, Gray Lee knew the future and understood that the real problem was inside the main tent. The instant he sensed that presence, he said they needed to flee, but when they reached the exit, the elite ogre blocked their path. However, that wasn't the true leader. Gray Lee had already sensed a much more powerful presence nearby. It was an ogre general, the true leader of that nest. It was a creature far beyond the enemies they had faced until then. Surya decided she would try to distract them so Gray Lee could escape. She then managed to strike the elite ogre with a blow. However, the general restored its strength. His roar increased both the power and recovery ability of his allies. That was why those monsters seemed so powerful. Gray Lee asked his master to guard the rear while he faced the general, because they needed to defeat him if they wanted to leave that place alive. Gray Lee struggled to get close because all the other ogres protected the general. That was precisely his greatest advantage, using superior numbers to prevent anyone from approaching. During the next attack, his sword shattered completely. Fortunately, he carried another one, though it didn't last long either. Saria then threw her spare sword to Gray Lee. With 2 blades to protect himself, he managed to advance through the ogres. But reaching General Kui was becoming increasingly difficult as he continued laughing. His presence made the enemy army even stronger. The enemies grew even more ferocious. Only then did they realize his plan, proving that the general's reputation for intelligence was well-deserved. He tried to force his way through them all, but moving forward was nearly impossible. In the middle of the battle, he was struck by one of the axes. The attacks gradually wore him down, including his weapons. Another orc's blow eventually shattered one of them. With his spare weapons destroyed, only Saria's sword remained. He would have to face hordes of ogres and the general himself with a single sword that could break at any moment. He knew victory under those conditions was impossible. Realizing this, he told his master to escape while there was still time. Even so, unfortunately, he continued fighting. Saria was still fighting the elite ogre, not because she wanted to stay there, but because she simply could not escape. She could barely run. Her legs were injured and extremely weak. Gray Lee realized that he had completely run out of options. He had traveled back in time to defeat the liquidator, yet now he might meet his end there, surrounded by ogres. Even with the broken sword, he thought about that power. If he could access it again, perhaps he still had a chance. Even those enemies might fall. He tried to recall that sensation, and shortly afterward, he felt the same power emerge. Then, his dark slash brought down the entire enemy army. Gray Lee smiled at his master and told her everything was fine. His slash tore through every creature and left the elite ogre severely weakened. Thanks to that, Saria managed to defeat it. Without the general, the enemies lost their strength. Gray Lee said that somehow they had managed to win and apologize for the broken sword. Then he wanted to know more about that attack. Before he could continue, however, he collapsed face first onto the ground, probably exhausted by the effort required for that strike. Then, he found himself surrounded by shadows, perhaps somewhere within his own consciousness. There was a door in that place, and something was waiting for him behind it. All that power lay beyond the door. If he opened it, he could obtain everything at once. It was the strength he needed to finally defeat the liquidator. When he tried to do something, he felt a presence gripping his neck. He understood that if he crossed that door at that moment, he would die. Then, a voice told him that he had made a good choice. When Gray Lee finally awakened, he was in the village infirmary and discovered that he had been unconscious for 5 days. Saria, his master, had feared he would never wake up. Gray Lee admitted that he had probably pushed himself too hard. Saria thought that description was far too mild for what had happened, but first she asked if he was all right. Gray Lee realized that his body was extremely weak, especially his right arm. He could still move it, but the limb felt completely numb. In addition, there was a strange bruise on his arm that looked anything but natural. Saria had already expected his right arm to take time to recover. After all, the bones in that area had suffered severe damage. He felt no pain because they had used a magic potion during his treatment. Gray Lee mentioned how expensive it was, but Saria explained that the village chief had provided everything as thanks. At that moment, the village chief appeared and called out to Gray Lee. Seeing him finally awake, Gray Lee took the opportunity to thank him for the potion. The chief replied that they were the ones who should be thanking him. Gray Lee had defeated an ogre general, a creature that even the combined forces of the neighboring cities would struggle to face. Without Gray Lee, the village would probably have been destroyed. Therefore, according to Saria and the chief, that potion was the least they could offer the hero responsible for everyone still being there. Gray Lee replied that the chief was surely exaggerating. The chief said that he was merely being modest. Gray Lee then remembered his previous life and realized it was true, because before his regression, that village had been destroyed by the ogres. The chief also mentioned that he had heard about Gray Lee's intention to take the World Union Academy entrance exam. Only then did Gray Lee realize the problem. He had fought the ogre a week earlier and spent 5 days unconscious, meaning he had missed the date. Worried, he asked if they could lend him a horse. The chief had already expected that request and had prepared the village's best horse for him in advance. Saria said that if he had not awakened that day, they intended to take him there even while he was still asleep. When he finally left the infirmary, Gray Lee was greeted by the villagers holding signs and roses while everyone expressed their gratitude. The people thanked the hero responsible for saving the village. He even received a sum of gold collected through small contributions from all the villagers. Everyone knew that the World Union Academy entrance exam was expensive. Gray Lee sincerely thanked them for the help, as returning to that village would be difficult if he failed. Saria told him not to worry. After all, none of the World Union Academy candidates had managed to defeat an ogre general. Gray Lee remembered that with his right arm in that condition, the exam would be much harder. Saria replied that he still had his left arm, and that alone would be enough. Even so, he doubted the examiners would be tolerant enough to pass him while he could only use one arm. Saria, however, was certain that the examiners would recognize the boy's talent. In her eyes, Gray Lee would definitely pass. After everything Saria and the villagers had done, he could not disappoint them. The village should have disappeared, but thanks to his actions, it was still standing. That world was no longer following the same path. The future could be changed, and Gray Lee intended to change it using the power he now possessed. After traveling for some time, he finally arrived at the World Union Academy. The place was surrounded by the Blue Sea, with several bridges leading toward its central area. Later, before the many assembled candidates, the Academy announced that it would begin distributing the exam tickets. Till the process was over, all candidates were required to remain in the central arena. The place was completely packed, even though only around 20 of them would be accepted. Apparently, the number of successful candidates varied each year. Some years, 50 candidates were admitted, while in others, only one person managed to pass. Then, Professor Ariel stepped forward to address everyone. Without wasting any more time, she began distributing the exam tickets using her own magic. Everyone received their papers, and Gray Lee discovered that he was candidate number 513 for the swordsmanship course. The professor explained that some of them might find it strange that the paper displayed only a number and a color. Shortly afterward, she explained the reason. Nationality, social status, and any other information were irrelevant. Only those who passed the exam and earned the right to cross the bridge would be asked for their names, and they could even provide false ones. Gray Lee had left his sword at an inn, yet his paper still correctly indicated the swordsmanship course. Ariel explained that she had assigned the courses based on the candidates' appearances and asked them to raise their hands if she had made any mistakes. However, no one responded. Everyone had been assigned to the correct course. Shortly afterward, new information appeared on the paper. Gray Lee would take his exam on the first day at 11 in the morning. He had hoped for more time to recover his arm, but he would not have that opportunity. Ariel explained that it would be a practical test held only once. Any delay would result in automatic disqualification, and individual requests to change the scheduled time would not be accepted. Gray Lee still could not exert much strength with his dominant arm. He could only hope to recover at least some of its movement by the following day. However, the next morning, his arm was still aching. Even so, he would take the test in that condition. Before entering, he took a deep breath and decided there was no reason to think pessimistically. His left arm worked perfectly, while his right still had some mobility. He needed to use the available time to analyze the examiner and find an opening. When he arrived, another candidate was still taking his combat test. The young man charged forward wielding a heavy sword. The examiner, however, avoided the attack with a single step to the side. Despite wielding a larger sword and showing considerable determination, the boy could not break through his opponent's defense. In fact, he never even managed to touch the examiner. Shortly afterward, he was disarmed and knocked down, bringing his evaluation to an end. Watching this, Gray Lee realized that he was in a truly difficult situation. Finally, candidate number 513 was called. Gray Lee thought his chances were slim, but as soon as he entered the arena, the examiner allowed him to attack first. Although he did not have much confidence in victory, Gray Lee decided to do everything within his power. He quickly advanced, closing the distance as he recalled the lessons he had received. His first wide arcing strike forced the examiner to dodge. This time, a simple step was not enough. The man had to shift his entire body. He then counterattacked with a movement that seemed surprisingly slow in Gray Lee's eyes. Gray Lee managed to defend himself. Physically, it was difficult, but his eyes followed the entire trajectory of the attack perfectly. The examiner's speed and technique were far below Surya's level. If he trusted the swordsmanship he had learned from his master, perhaps Gray Lee really could compensate for the limitations of his right arm. Realizing this, he began pressing forward in earnest. Little by little, the examiner began to feel the pressure. To Gray Lee, his movements seemed slow. Gray Lee then remembered Surya saying that he would certainly pass. Because of that, he remained confident. After some time, he had already grasped nearly the man's entire swordsmanship style. The real problem was his right arm, which still was not responding properly. Under those conditions, the fight remained difficult. Securing victory or landing a decisive blow would not be easy. However, the examiner's movements were becoming increasingly disorganized. Noticing an opening deliberately created by the examiner, Gray Lee prepared an opening of his own and responded with an unexpected counterattack from behind. However, before the tip of his sword could reach the examiner, someone stopped the fight. The time limit had expired, bringing the match to an end in a draw. Gray Lee had failed to win, despite giving it everything he had. Without saying much, he simply expressed his thanks before leaving the area. A week later, the professors gathered in a room at the World Union Academy. They discussed the performances of the candidates who had completed their exams with victories. Some were exhausted and complained that evaluating everyone together was inefficient. In their opinion, dividing the work would have been better. Others argued that making the process easier did not justify overlooking potential talent. The oldest professor then asked them to discuss the candidates rather than the evaluation system. Thus, they began reviewing the swordsmanship exam. Anyone who had defeated the examiner had passed, while the others would be judged according to different criteria. For those candidates, the quality they had demonstrated during the fight and their ability to endure until the established limit would be considered. The maximum time was 15 minutes. Besides those who had defeated the examiner, several participants had also distinguished themselves considerably, so they would remain in consideration. At that moment, Professor Ariel asked what they would do with candidate number 513. Some acknowledged that the boy had nearly won, but argued that relying on traps against the examiner suggested he would face serious difficulties within the academy. His technique was good, but he lacked strength. For that reason, the professors decided to reject the boy. Ariel, however, thought that no one had noticed the important detail. If they were all so inattentive, perhaps observing the tests together really had been pointless. The following day, everyone gathered once again in the main square of the World Union Academy. The time had come to announce those who had passed. Candidates whose cards burned away were accepted, and shortly afterward, all the results were revealed. Gray Lee realized that he had not passed. He had indeed failed the regular selection, but the Divine Eye special admission still remained. To his surprise, Gray Lee was the only person accepted through special admission. It was the first time he had even heard of such an admission process. The nobles claimed that someone had managed to get in through connections behind the scenes. Gray Lee then wondered whether one of his master's connections had secured his admission. However, an older gentleman explained that the Divine Eye special admission did not work that way. It was a respected category that had produced heroes for over 100 years. The nobles, however, mocked the elders for valuing the system so highly, saying only the candidates from the past had been impressive. Among those admitted were Amy White, Bella Albright, Brian Miller, and Jacob. To the nobles, they were all failures, something even the current candidates supposedly knew. Upon hearing those names, Gray Lee recognized every one of them immediately. Amy White, Bella, Brian, and Jacob were precisely humanity's most powerful group, the main force opposing the Liquidator. And now Gray Lee's name would also be placed alongside theirs. By the time of the entrance ceremony, Gray Lee and the other successful applicants were already wearing their uniforms. Everyone headed to the plaza in front of the main building, but nothing had been prepared there. Shortly afterward, a staff member appeared and apologized for the delay. He asked the students to step back a little, and once everyone had moved away, he began the preparations. The man activated his magic, causing an enormous magic circle to cover the entire plaza. Suddenly, a massive arena appeared, surrounded by stairways and stands. The staff member apologized again for the delay and invited everyone inside. The students entered while discussing the teleportation magic. What surprised them was discovering that something so enormous could be transported in such a short time. Gray Lee took a seat and figured they had chosen that location so the school building would remain visible during the ceremony. It was extravagant, but it perfectly demonstrated the power of the World Union Academy. One student was puzzled by the enormous number of seats, considering how few candidates had been accepted. A girl explained that the World Union, just as its name suggested, gathered the finest students on the planet. Soon afterward, they began to arrive. Some came riding dragons, while others arrived aboard aircraft and airships. Enormous magical airships also appeared, impressive forms of transportation that were absurdly expensive. Finally, the other successful students from various parts of the world arrived at the venue. Then the same professor who had appeared earlier began the entrance ceremony. After the staff members' speeches, Leonhardt, considered the finest student in the swordsmanship course, stepped onto the stage. It was time for his address. Leonhardt was already known by everyone as an exceptionally talented student. Since he had the freedom to speak as he pleased, the moment Leonhardt reached the podium, he took the opportunity to voice a complaint against the academy. First, he addressed his new classmates, especially those who had earned their places through the conventional route, saying it was an honor to study alongside them at that academy. He said he hoped everyone would work together to become people capable of contributing to the world. As students of the prestigious World Union Academy, they could aim ever higher. However, he said that unfortunately, some people there did not deserve that opportunity. He then asked Professor Ariel, the Divine Eye, whether he was wrong. Ariel replied that everyone had undergone rigorous evaluations. Even if some were not as strong as Leonhardt, that was no justification for excluding them. Therefore, simply removing them would not be right. She then asked why Leonhardt was raising the issue. Leonhardt explained that he was not referring to students who had passed the examinations normally. His criticism was directed at those Ariel had placed there through influence. He was referring to those chosen through the Divine Eye's special admission. He then demanded that the student admitted that way come forward and return the academy uniform. Gray Lee wondered what that guy's problem was. Fortunately, when he had stood up earlier, he had been beside him, so Leonhardt still did not know his face. Ariel merely remarked that the new students seemed quite enthusiastic. Leonhardt tried to maintain his composure, but Ariel quickly appeared behind him and asked whether he truly believed he was stronger than that boy. Leonhardt answered without hesitation that he was obviously superior. Ariel seemed to like that confidence, and then she proposed a wager, putting both her position and that boy's admission at stake. Leonhardt asked whether she intended to make him fight the special admission student directly. Ariel replied that she would never do anything so reckless. According to her, if the boy fought at full strength, Leonhardt would stand no chance. As an educator, Ariel could not place her students in such danger. The provocation struck the blonde young man hard, leaving him visibly irritated, and Ariel was completely serious. Therefore, she suggested settling the wager by fighting monsters. That way would be much safer. Besides, Leonhardt had more experience fighting monsters than humans. The rules would be quite simple. With each round, the chosen monster would become stronger. Whoever failed first to defeat their own target would lose the contest. If the special student lost, Ariel would leave her position and all the other special admissions would be expelled. If Leonhardt lost, he would have to obey any order she gave. Leonhardt asked her to reveal which monsters they would face first. Although confident in his ability against any opponent, he did not want to fall into some kind of trap. Ariel replied that the first target could be an ogre general. She then asked whether that would be too easy for him. Lee immediately found that choice strange. Why that particular monster? It seemed as though something was being hidden. Since something is happening around here, take the opportunity to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and take the opportunity to check out our membership club as well. If you can, support the project. The entire team is working hard to bring you increasingly better content for your entertainment. So consider helping by leaving a like. It costs nothing, just like subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. And it is very simple. Just click there. On a TV, simply navigate through the options until you find the button and leave your like. On a phone, simply exit full screen mode and swipe down. That way, you can subscribe, leave a like, and turn on notifications. On a computer, it is even easier. Simply scroll down the page. Consider supporting the channel. Thank you very much. Now let us return to the video. Leonhardt declared that it was absurd. After all, an ogre general was not a monster anyone could defeat alone. Ariel explained that no one needed to defeat it immediately. They would have the remainder of that entire year as their deadline. Leonhardt replied that if someone could defeat such a creature after only 1 year of training, nobody would struggle against monsters. He then realized Ariel had deliberately chosen an impossible target so the wager would end without a winner. The professor then added another condition. In the event of a tie, Leonhardt would be considered the winner. Therefore, all he needed was for the other boy to fail to defeat the ogre general. In that case, Ariel would automatically lose her position and all the special students would be expelled. To Leonhardt, that professor had to be insane. Since he raised no objection, Ariel considered the wager accepted. Still suspicious, he asked whether the ogre general would be weakened in any way. Ariel assured him that there would be no such advantage. Every detail and condition had already been recorded in the magical contract. Leonhardt naturally signed the contract and asked whether Ariel still believed the boy would win. She simply returned to her seat, saying she would reveal nothing more about the wager. Everyone around her said she had completely lost her mind, including the honored guests. Lee realized that the bet had already been made official, and he had been dragged into it without even having a say. Ariel, however, had known from the beginning that the bet was already settled. She glared at Grain in the audience and told him to keep quiet. That woman was truly playing dirty. The next class covered the basic concepts and fundamentals of magic. Some might find a lecture strange on the very first day, but as academy students, they needed to remember that not a single day should be wasted. The explanation began with the basic principle behind using magic. Everybody possesses an invisible energy called ether, which can be manipulated through magical circuits to materialize spells. Meanwhile, Lee felt relieved. He had feared he would struggle to keep up with the lessons, but so far he was doing well, since he had already heard those explanations at the training camp while preparing to save humanity. His real problem now was that he had ended up in the same class as Leonhardt. He thought that no one could find out he was the student specially admitted by the Divine Eye. However, the professor called on Lee himself and remarked that he looked bored. He said it was bold of him to look away during class, and if he was so confident, he could demonstrate basic magic for everyone. Lee respectfully replied that they were in the swordsmanship course and assumed there would be no problem if they did not use magic. The professor admitted that made sense, but explained that even if they only used swords in battle, they needed to understand basic magic to coordinate with mages. Lee thought the explanation was identical to the one from the training camp. When Lee asked whether they would learn ether projectile, the professor confirmed it and asked whether he could use it. Lee replied that he knew that spell. At least all that grueling training at the camp had not been useless. The professor saw a good opportunity and suggested turning the demonstration into a duel. He then asked whether Leonhardt also knew how to use the spell. Leonhardt replied that he did. Even before entering the academy, he had trained in both swordsmanship and magic, and he asked whether it would be dangerous dangerous for his opponent. The professor assured him that the boy would not die and that neither of them needed to use their full strength. He then revealed that this was Gray Lee, the student chosen by the Divine Eye that year. Gray Lee thought that was exactly what he had wanted to avoid most. The professor had deliberately revealed everything. Leonhardt then showed that he was ready to teach Gray Lee what kind of place the World Academy truly was. Gray Lee had worked so hard to avoid that confrontation, yet he had ended up in exactly the same situation. Later, the two stood facing each other, and the professor explained that at his signal, they were to fire their projectiles at one another. Gray Lee had studied magic for only a few days at the training camp. Even after hearing that he would not die, he found it hard to believe he could emerge from that duel completely unscathed. Leonhardt intended to make the difference in power between them perfectly clear. However, the projectile launched by Gray Lee was much larger. Moreover, it had a dark appearance. Even he could not understand what was happening. Leonhardt's projectile was swallowed up, forcing the professor to raise a magical barrier. Even so, the shield shattered, and the explosion sent Leonhardt flying. The professor had not expected anything of that intensity. Without the barrier reducing the impact, Leonhardt could have suffered far more serious consequences. Even among the professors, producing such a powerful projectile would not be easy. Surprised, he asked what Gray Lee had just done. Gray Lee, however, could only think about how weak Leonhardt's projectile had seemed. It hardly even looked like the same spell he knew. Perhaps the ether projectile taught in the squad was different from the version used at the academy. He then asked whether he had cast the wrong spell. The professor replied that he had not. It was definitely an ether projectile, but its quality was on an entirely different level. Gray Lee had not used ordinary ether, but extremely compressed ether, something even experienced professors struggled to produce. Even so, at that moment he had managed to shape that energy into a spell. According to the professor, no one at the academy could easily reproduce what Gray Lee had just done. Naturally, the students began talking about Gray Lee. He, however, thought that was impossible since every spell he had learned in the training camp's subjugation squad worked that way, and among all its members, Gray Lee had been considered one of the weakest. He asked whether the professor was joking. In his view, anyone should be able to do that with enough training. The professor merely responded with genuine laughter. He then asked why Gray Lee did not transfer to the magic course and said he could personally recommend him. Gray Lee refused. He preferred swordsmanship and believed he was not particularly skilled at magic. The professor said that was absurd. Gray Lee understood ether compression so well that he could achieve such a result with very little effort. To him, Gray Lee was a prodigy even by the academy standards. He could not imagine who might have told the boy that he lacked talent. The students began concluding that Gray Lee truly must be extraordinary, considering how highly the professor himself was praising his abilities. The professor even declared that it would be a waste to the world if Gray Lee did not study magic. He went so far as to say that it would almost be a crime against. Gray Lee found himself thinking about that ether compression technique. After considering it more carefully, he finally understood. He had already heard about that technique a long time ago. The great sage Bella Albright herself had explained to him that in the past, people did not even know of the existence of life force, which made casting magic properly far more difficult. It was necessary to continuously compress ether inside the body and try to use only the portions that happened to mix with OD. To Bella, merely thinking about that ancient method was almost amusing. Gray Lee then asked the professor whether he knew what OD meant. The professor had absolutely no idea. Upon seeing his reaction, Gray Lee was able to confirm a suspicion. The world still knew nothing about the existence of OD. If that was true, then everything he had learned in the subjugation squad was knowledge from the future. It was a far more advanced technique. Even so, Gray Lee once again declined the proposal to join the magic course. The professor said that if this was truly what he wanted, then nothing could be done. But if he ever changed his mind, he could come to him at any time. He also said that he no longer cared if Gray Lee became bored during class, since that material was far too basic for him anyway. As he returned to his seat, Gray Lee noticed that the other students were still struggling to believe the power he had demonstrated. Instead of becoming angry, Leonhardt seemed completely fascinated. To Gray Lee, that reaction was especially strange. At the end of the day, Gray Lee was summoned to the administration office. The summons came without warning. Perhaps it had come from Professor Carlos, who was responsible for magic, or even from Ariel, trying to persuade him to change courses. But Gray Lee had absolutely no intention of doing that. The moment he opened the door, he was immediately greeted by his body reacted instinctively, allowing him to block the attack in time. However, the girl responsible for the attack looked extremely familiar to him. Ariel remarked that he had done very well and confirmed that her assessment had been correct. The other professors assumed Bella had held back. Although his movements were flawless, losing his sword so easily seemed strange, making one of them wonder whether that really was Bella Albright, the sorceress. Ariel declared that professors so incompetent should simply resign from their positions. After what they had just witnessed, they had no choice but to agree. They then handed Ariel several coins. They had all bet on whether Gray Lee could block that surprise attack. This academy truly seemed full of eccentric people. As her commission, Ariel even placed a gold coin in Gray Lee's hand, and he immediately realized how valuable that reward was. One of the professors then remarked that, as Ariel had noticed during the previous exchange, there was something clearly deliberate about his movements. Gray Lee apparently avoided using his dominant arm, as though he were deliberately protecting that side of his body. He kept the arm almost completely still, perhaps because of an injury or an even more serious problem. Surprised, Gray Lee asked if they could really tell all that simply by observing his movements. They replied that if they were incapable of doing so, they wouldn't deserve to teach at the World Union Academy. Ariel then told everyone to leave. Gray Lee was her student, so she had no intention of handing him over to anyone else. The professors acknowledged that he possessed considerable potential. However, they warned that there would be a problem if his injury didn't improve. His current condition, he wouldn't be able to meet the requirements for admission to the academy. After everyone finally left, Ariel remarked that they could now talk in peace. With those troublesome people gone, they could finally discuss the matter involving magic. Later, Ariel, Gray Lee, and Bella were having tea together. The professor explained that she had heard about the super compressed ether he had used during Professor Carlos's class. Carlos had even visited her office to ask that Gray Lee be transferred to the magic course. Naturally, Ariel refused. In her opinion, Gray Lee was far more suited to wielding a sword than pursuing the path of magic. She then removed her monocle, revealing her magical eye, possibly known as the Divine Eye. Gray Lee knew that woman could see far more than she appeared to, so lying would be pointless. He admitted that she was right and that he preferred the sword. Ariel wanted to know what technique he had used and promised to keep it secret. In exchange for the explanation, she would also offer him a reward. She genuinely needed that answer because of Bella. Although the girl was brilliant in magical theory, her practical abilities still left much to be desired. For some reason, Bella hadn't properly mastered the ether compression technique. Because of that, she was unable to produce super compressed ether. Gray Lee had already heard rumors that Bella Albright was considered behind in that field, and according to what Ariel had learned from Professor Carlos, something seemed unusual. When Gray Lee used super compressed ether, he didn't appear to be deliberately compressing the energy. Everything happened completely naturally. If he could teach Bella the same method, she wouldn't need to be referred to Professor Varian. Gray Lee asked if they were talking about Varian. It was practically impossible not to know that man, since his reputation was exceptionally terrible. After all, he had conducted countless experiments involving human subjects. Many people had suffered during those experiments, which had also caused numerous magical disasters. Varian was considered the worst magical criminal in history. At that point in time, however, he had yet to be captured. Ariel explained that if Bella couldn't produce super compressed ether by the end of the year, she would be sent to Varian for surgery. Gray Lee immediately said that was a terrible idea. Ariel agreed. Although it was presented as surgery to enhance magical abilities, it was actually a dangerous human experiment. Rumors claimed that several people had suffered severe consequences because of it. Despite knowing the risks, Bella was willing to undergo the procedure, since the alternative was expulsion from the academy. Ariel sincerely preferred that Bella leave the academy rather than allow that repulsive man to perform surgery on her. Gray Lee knew that all the magical knowledge he possessed belonged to a far more advanced era and didn't yet exist in the present. Revealing it could alter history, but he couldn't ignore the situation. If the future he knew was so terrible, perhaps changing it was the better choice, even if he had to bear the consequences. After thinking for a few moments, Gray Lee confirmed that he would teach Bella how to produce super compressed ether. Later, in the arena, he began drawing on the board while explaining everything he knew about that magical principle. The explanation was relatively simple. Gray Lee only asked that no one reveal that he was the one who had taught them the method. Ariel said that wouldn't even be possible, since they had signed a magical contract with fatal consequences if broken. Even so, she was impressed by the knowledge Gray Lee had revealed. Bella found the explanation brief, yet extremely well organized. To her, it felt as though she were attending a magic lesson far beyond her era. It was like receiving a lesson from centuries in the future. That explanation alone seemed capable of advancing the development of magic by nearly 100 years. Gray Lee noticed the irony, since that knowledge actually came from a lecture Bella would give 10 years in the future. To someone from this era, it truly seemed a century ahead. Ariel admitted that she had received so much new information that she couldn't properly evaluate all of it at that moment. Bella, however, believed the theory had a strong chance of being correct, since nothing in Gray Lee's explanation contradicted currently known magical principles. There was an even faster way to confirm everything: simply test it. If Gray Lee's theory was correct, the spell would work. Bella then decided to unleash all her power. Gray Lee remembered that Bella Albright possessed enough power to set an entire city ablaze, and he grew worried, especially since she was also known for having difficulty controlling her magical output. However, at that moment, Bella managed to concentrate her power into an enormous pillar of flame that surged into the sky with astonishing intensity. If she hadn't taken control of the magic immediately after casting it, everyone there could have been struck by the tremendous heat. Bella, however, was delighted when she realized that she had finally managed to control that powerful pillar of fire. Soon afterward, the flames took the form of a gigantic fire dragon. To Bella, controlling that magic seemed simply enjoyable. She truly loved magic. However, However, she ended up consuming so much ether during the test that she lost consciousness. Lee managed to catch her before she fell. Ariel explained that there was no reason to worry since Bella had merely fainted after completely exhausting her ether. Ariel was impressed to see Bella master magic of that level in such a short time. Curiously, without realizing it, Bella herself would create that theory in the future. Ariel celebrated because Bella could now produce super compressed ether and would no longer need the surgery. She would personally contact Varian to cancel the risky procedure. Ariel was also relieved that Bella had maintained control over her magic. Varian's surgery could increase magical output, but apparently did so by sacrificing some control through artificially breaking the body's natural limits. Lee realized that the surgery probably explained why Bella had struggled to control her power in the original timeline. Now, thanks to him, she had fulfilled the contract, so Ariel needed to uphold her end of the agreement. After looking at his injured arm, she decided to use magic. It was healing magic that made his arm almost completely recovered. It looked as good as new again. He asked how she had managed to do that. Not even a magical healing potion had been able to. Ariel told him not to compare her nerve restoration magic with ordinary potions. Then she asked whether his arm was truly moving like before. He swung the sword to test it and realized the movement still was not as smooth as it used to be. Ariel might have restored his nerves, but her magic could not heal everything. Even so, Ariel believed that, with her divine eye, she could see that his soul was gradually recovering and would naturally restore itself over time. As long as he did not push himself beyond his limits, he could still continue practicing with the sword. More than that, Ariel wanted to discover what kind of swordsmanship could damage his soul so badly. Lee, of course, had no intention of explaining. The professor mentioned that there was also a style of swordsmanship capable of using one's own soul to move the sword. Then she asked whether he knew Amy White. Lee found it strange to hear the sword saint's name. At that point in time, the two of them should not even have met yet. Ariel said the way he wielded his sword gave the impression that he had learned from her, although there was a slight difference. Whoever had trained him seemed even more skilled than Amy White. However, within a few years, she would reach a level similar to his master's. Lee found Ariel's deductive ability frightening. Without knowing the truth, she had nearly concluded that he had learned from the future Amy White. Then he asked whether a technique could really injure the soul. Ariel replied that under normal circumstances, that would not happen, at least not because of ordinary swordsmanship. And naturally, there was also nothing ordinary about defeating an ogre general with a single strike, while also bringing down several ogres and even the surrounding trees. Lee asked whether she already knew about that. Ariel said yes and explained that thanks to him, she had practically won the bet. They had shown her some traces left at the scene. To her, it was impressive, since not even extremely advanced cutting magic could produce the same result. Ariel asked whether that came from the mysterious power inside him. With her divine eye, she could see it as well. She could see energy leaking through the chain door within him. Lee knew that could not be mere guesswork. Ariel could truly see into his consciousness. Ariel revealed that she had seen a power similar to his before. She did not believe they were exactly the same, but both possessed a similar aura. She knew those forces. She simply did not believe they were human powers. They were called liquidators. Hearing that name, Lee was shaken. What he did not understand was why the term was already being mentioned in that era. Ariel had not expected him to know about it, although his theories about magic also seemed to come from a far more advanced age. Lee grew uncomfortable and did not know how to explain the situation. The professor then asked how much he truly knew about a liquidator. He replied that it was an extremely dangerous threat to humanity and had to be stopped before it emerged. If that failed, they would need to eliminate it at any cost. Ariel considered the answer somewhat extreme, but agreed that the danger was real. Even so, Varian seemed determined to continue with his experiments. Lee asked what Varian had to do with it. Ariel explained that the liquidator was precisely the creature he intended to summon. Lee was shocked, since no one had ever said that being had been created by someone. On the other hand, in the previous timeline, the Academy had seemed to know exactly where the liquidator would appear. Lee then asked whether the institution had taken part in the summoning. To him, that experiment needed to be stopped immediately. Ariel agreed, but unfortunately, the one in charge of that situation, in the end, without an order from the leadership, no one had the authority to force Varian to terminate the experiment. Lee was not given any name. He only realized that the Academy's leadership was far more complicated and mysterious than he had imagined. However, he thought everything would change if they could prove that Varian was a criminal. In the original timeline, those illegal experiments had caused tens of thousands of casualties, and Lee knew exactly where they had been conducted. So he told Ariel that if they could catch him in the act, she explained that even then, it would not be simple. Breaking into an Academy professor's research facility was also considered a serious crime. Without concrete evidence, they themselves could end up imprisoned. Unless Lee presented solid proof, there was little they could do. Lee realized that even though Ariel understood the danger of the situation, her hands were tied. He finally understood the problem. Ariel then changed the subject and returned to his power. She said she could help him control it, since the Academy had a professor specializing in unknown forces named Half-Coach Longfellow. Gray Lee immediately recognized that name. He was the man who had trained the Sword Saint herself, and Ariel knew that would catch his attention. She would arrange for him to begin private training with the professor as early as the following day. Gray Lee had not expected to find a clue capable of helping him with that power so quickly. The next morning, he began receiving private lessons directly from Longfellow. At first, however, the two of them merely ran through the forest. The professor could maintain a much faster pace than Gray Lee. Longfellow noticed that his mind was distracted. He said that if he still had enough energy to think about other things, then he needed to run faster. Gray Lee had to push his body to its limit. Only after exhausting all his physical strength would it be possible to awaken the power of his soul. As long as he had any energy left, they would not even touch a sword. Gray Lee replied that he understood, although he kept wondering what the purpose of that training was while running in circles. Meanwhile, Varian continued conducting experiments to summon the damned liquidator. Gray Lee began to wonder whether he really should be spending his time that way. After approximately a week of training with Longfellow, Ariel asked Gray Lee how the sessions were progressing. He replied that he spent nearly all his time running and only did a little sword training at the end. Even so, he felt much stronger and full of energy. Ariel remarked that this matched Longfellow's method perfectly. Suddenly, an employee appeared and handed Ariel a letter that had just arrived. As soon as she read its contents, her expression immediately turned serious. Gray Lee was also surprised when he read the message. Ariel's report stated that Bella Albright had produced super-compressed ether, but the response claimed that she had only obtained a similar power. According to Varian, Bella had not truly compressed ether, so her new ability could not be recognized as super-compressed ether. Therefore, the contract remained valid, and the operation would proceed as planned. Gray Lee said that was a lie and sounded completely insane. Ariel explained that Varian was determined to force her to undergo the surgery even though it was unnecessary. However, the contract contained loopholes they could exploit. As long as Varian refused to void the contract, Bella had only two choices, expulsion or surgery. They needed Gray Lee and asked where the laboratory was, since exposing Varian's crimes would invalidate the agreement. Gray Lee then reminded her that she herself had said how dangerous it would be to act without evidence. Ariel replied that they would find proof and decided to trust him. In truth, perhaps she had been trusting him from the very beginning. Her divine eye indicated that Gray Lee had been telling the truth from the start. After admitting that, Ariel asked him to show the way. The laboratory was in the mountains near Torwell Village, officially authorized despite concealing illegal research. Ariel observed that it was precisely the perfect place for illegal activities. No one would find it strange for Varian to remain there for long periods, and no academy professor would have any reason to interfere with his laboratory. As long as they found evidence of his crimes, they could justify breaking into the laboratory. Suddenly, Bella entered the professor's office while holding the letter. Ariel immediately took the letter and told her there was no need to worry, because she would resolve the situation. Bella replied that Ariel didn't need to confront the professor alone because of her. Ariel, however, said she was capable of handling it by herself and insisted that would be enough. Gray Lee and Bella insisted on accompanying her. Bella in particular said she needed to go because the problem directly concerned her. Ariel explained that students shouldn't get involved. If the professor captured either of them, no one knew what might happen. It was far too dangerous and completely reckless. Gray Lee replied that this was exactly why Ariel shouldn't go alone. If he could use the power he had unleashed against the Ogre General again, he could be a great help. He also reminded her that if Ariel disappeared, everyone admitted by the Divine Eye would be expelled, including him. For that reason, he wanted a say in deciding his own future. The professor realized that the two of them would follow her even if she tried to stop them. So she allowed them to come along, but set one condition. No matter what happened, they had to put their own safety first. The group headed into the mountains near the village, where they found the professor's enormous and impressive laboratory. Bella trusted the information Gray Lee had provided, but still asked whether they could gather the evidence without running into trouble. Ariel knew that Varian was supposed to be attending a Magic Society conference at that moment. He wouldn't be there, though he had probably protected the entrance with several traps. Because of that, they would have to enter through the side wall. Since breaking into an authorized laboratory was already considered a crime anyway, the distinction hardly mattered. Bella said she would continue regardless, though she was still uneasy. She then asked whether they were truly doing all of this for someone like her. Gray Lee replied that she was mistaken. Stopping that man's experiments would benefit far more people, because if no one stopped him, countless lives could be put at risk. Ariel remarked that Gray Lee might be exaggerating a little, but she completely agreed that Varian had to be stopped. They weren't risking their lives solely for Bella, and they made sure she understood that so she wouldn't burden herself with guilt. After that, they moved forward, and Ariel began using her magic. With a powerful spell, she blasted open a passage through the laboratory's side wall. Gray Lee thought that entrance was a little excessive, but he still took the lead. By chance, the destroyed wall opened into a prison. Inside were several severely weakened people, some with permanent after effects, all apparently used in cruel experiments. With a single inspection, Ariel identified 14 forbidden spells, already proving several crimes. Afterward, they found an enormous chamber containing what looked like an altar surrounded by a magic circle. Bella asked what they should do next. The original plan was simply to leave with the evidence, but perhaps they also needed to free the people being held there. However, the exact moment that was mentioned, Varian appeared before them. The professor explained that he had sent a substitute to the conference because he had an important experiment to conduct personally in that laboratory. He had recently obtained new materials for his research and intended to use them immediately. However, with the intruder's arrival, his plans had changed. Varian also wanted materials with greater magical potential than ordinary people possessed, and those two students had appeared at the perfect time. They had walked straight into his laboratory. If the three of them disappeared there, hardly anyone would suspect him. Varian said their sacrifice would contribute to the advancement of magic, since he had no intention of allowing them to leave. Since he couldn't let them leave that place alive, he would at least make sure they were useful to his research. Before he could finish his speech, however, Bella launched an enormous fireball directly at him. Varian found the spell impressive, but managed to block it. He also remarked that Ariel's divine eye continued to choose remarkably talented students. Perhaps, he thought, he should start paying closer attention to the new recruits she selected. The professor was impressed by the girl's technique, but commented on the audacity of a student directly attacking a professor. Bella replied that she preferred to act before he defeated her. Ariel then suggested retreating, since they already had enough evidence and could leave the rest to the academy. Naturally, Varian had no intention of simply letting them leave. He launched his black flames directly toward Bella. Ariel immediately stepped in front of her and had to protect her. Varian declared that the barrier would be useless. His devouring flame produced fire capable of consuming the very magic used for defense. Defensive energy served as fuel, causing the black flames to grow even stronger as they wore down the shield. In theory, blocking that magic was impossible. Its only weakness was that casting it required extremely valuable materials, but Varian considered the expense entirely worthwhile. Ariel had to create a second layer of protection, which also quickly began to crack. The professor told Bella to hand the spell memory pouch to Grey Lee. According to her, Half-Coach would know exactly what to do with it. Bella, however, didn't obey. Instead, she remained beside Ariel to help her contain Varian's power. Ariel's barrier was giving way, so Bella decided to take over that role. The moment the first defense shattered, she cast something even more powerful. Varian was stunned. The anti-magic theory behind the devouring flame was known only to him, so he demanded to know how Bella had discovered it. Bella simply replied that she had recently learned a new theory. With that knowledge, creating that kind of spell had become relatively simple. Varian then demanded to know who had revealed that secret and promised to make things quicker if she answered. Bella said her teacher's identity was a secret, revealing only that he studied in the swordsmanship course. Grey Lee thought that, in truth, he himself had developed much of that theory. Varian replied that if she had no intention of speaking seriously, then so be it. He decided to intensify the attack and use more materials, including a magic crystal. Using the crystal, he conjured dark magical forms that further increased the power of his devouring flame. Even against the strengthened attack, the barrier Bella had created continued to hold. The problem was that her mana reserves could not sustain that situation forever. Ariel used the divine eye to locate a gap in the flames and realized that she could still send mana beyond the barrier. However, the instant she fired her lightning bolt, the attack was completely absorbed. Varian stated that the counterattack was useless because it would never be able to reach him. Grey Lee remembered that Professor Ariel's offensive magic was among the weakest in the faculty. Combined with the properties of Varian's flames, her spells had probably been completely absorbed. Bella was already nearly out of mana, and Ariel had warned them earlier that they needed to escape. Even so, Grey Lee stepped forward and said he would rather act than let the three of them die in that place. He finally gathered enough energy and released his dark power. In the next instant, Varian saw everything around him turn upside down. In the blink of an eye, he had been defeated by a strike that severed his head from his body. Neither Bella nor Ariel could understand what had happened. That was even more astonishing considering that the professor possessed the divine eye. However, the impact of that attack was so intense that the entire laboratory began to collapse. Fortunately, Ariel cast defensive magic in time and held back the debris before it could strike the group. She asked whether his body was all right. Grey Lee replied that his right arm hurt badly and was still numb. The shadows were still affecting his arm, though he could still move it. Ariel then remarked, apparently the training was working. Without Professor Half-Coach Longfellow's insane sessions, Ray probably would have collapsed already. Grey Lee agreed. If this had happened back when he lived in the village, he probably would have remained unconscious for days. Back then, he might not even have been able to move either arm after waking up. Now he only felt severe pain in one of them, which already represented major progress. Ariel thanked him for saving everyone. Even so, she apologized for forcing him to use that power. Grey replied that she did not need to blame herself because it had been his decision. Ariel, however, spoke seriously. He needed to avoid using that force for a while, or the consequences could become permanent. Bella asked whether it was some kind of magic because she had not sensed any ether at all. Ariel knew that power could not be explained that way and preferred that Bella stop investigating the matter. She also demanded that Bella keep everything secret. If she refused to promise, Ariel would have to erase her memories of what had happened. Bella immediately agreed and performed a magical pact that would prevent her from revealing anything about what had happened. Grey Lee said that despite their concern about those experiments, they should first help the people being held prisoner. It seemed that all of them had been put to sleep by magic. Ariel explained that even though they were no longer in immediate danger, they needed to be taken to the Academy's medical facilities. She then created magical barriers around every person present there. Only after that could they investigate the laboratory more carefully. There they found the professor's so-called fresh ingredients. The sight was disturbing, and nearly every illegal experiment conducted in that place involved forbidden practices. Many of those experiments used human lives as part of the process to create magical catalysts or enhance people's magical abilities. Even so, Ariel found nothing related to the liquidator. Gray found that strange, because this was the place where tens of thousands had died in his timeline. A simple catalyst could not explain such a massive tragedy. He then remembered that back then, the deaths had been caused by a miasma that emerged from underground. That indicated there was something beneath the laboratory. Gray told Ariel that there might be some underground structure or hidden passage in that place. At first glance, she could not identify any concealed entrance, but when she directed her gaze toward even deeper areas, Ariel finally noticed something. It was extremely faint, but there were traces of short-range teleportation magic, indicating a space that could only be accessed that way. From the traces she found, she calculated that the location was approximately 300 meters away. Graylee asked whether they could get there. Since Ariel also mastered short-range teleportation, she decided to try, and with a snap of her fingers, she opened a portal that took the three of them directly to their destination. When they arrived, they were stunned by the scale of the underground place. Bella immediately noticed an enormous amount of ether spreading everywhere. Ariel, however, explained that it was not merely ether. Another kind of energy was present, completely different from magic and far more powerful than any force she had ever sensed. In truth, that energy belonged to the liquidator. The group advanced toward the center of the enormous underground city built beneath the laboratory and found massive doors. The energy came directly from there. However, those doors did not lead to any room and stood at the center of a ritual symbol. Even so, there was no sign that the liquidator was actually present in his complete form. Ariel realized that the doors themselves contained no energy at all. She even passed straight through one of them without difficulty. The true power was concentrated in the magic circle and the capsules scattered around it. At that moment, however, the magical energy unexpectedly activated all of those capsules. The magic circle began to glow, followed by the doors, whose surfaces split apart and took on the appearance of a portal. While the students panicked at the sight, Ariel remained surprisingly calm. Suddenly, everything stopped as though the mechanism had failed. Ariel then realized that those devices did not summon the liquidator, they merely created a small rift leading to the place where he existed. Their purpose was to channel the energy leaking through that opening. Ariel suspected that human lives were being used as a core to crystallize that power. From what she could analyze, around 10 souls had already been used, not counting any additional sacrifices made during the shaping process. That meant many of the people found in the cells above had probably been used as raw material for that terrible experiment. Bella then asked why anyone would go so far merely to accumulate that energy. Ariel answered immediately. According to her, the black flames Varian had used during the battle were precisely a product of that process. The crystal that increased his power was essentially the final result those structures were designed to produce. And that catalyst probably was not limited to flames. The intention seemed to be mass production, though no one knew what the ultimate purpose might be. The rift finally closed. Graylee then asked whether that meant Varian had not been trying to summon the liquidator directly. Ariel replied that he might never have tried, or perhaps had simply been unable to do so. The spatial opening circles were already at the limit of what they could accomplish with the available materials. Bella remarked that the mechanism was absurdly expensive. She had never witnessed spatial distortion magic so precise and powerful. The professor explained that producing even one of those devices would consume an entire nation's budget. Having 8 was extraordinary, and only one organization possessed resources in magical research at that level, the World Union Academy. Ariel confirmed the conclusion. No other research institution had the infrastructure or resources needed to sustain a project of that scale. Bella found it difficult to believe the Academy itself was involved, since the World Union was supposed to protect the world. Graylee also doubted that everyone there was an enemy, since many members would fight to the end for humanity in the future. Ariel agreed that most members probably truly acted in humanity's defense and would never approve experiments of that kind. However, the Academy had so many researchers and secret facilities that no one knew everything. Varian clearly had powerful backing, since he could never have organized all that using only his own authority. The professor explained that many of them probably believed they were acting for humanity's sake. Even those involved in that experiment might have convinced themselves of it, while the true situation remained hidden. Graylee asked whether there was any clue about who was behind everything. Even with the divine eye, Ariel found no communication devices or traces of the creator's magic. The place had been carefully cleaned. Before Ariel could finish explaining, the facility's self-destruct system was activated. The entire dome began collapsing. It was clearly part of a mechanism designed to erase any remaining evidence. Since it had not exploded immediately after Varian's death, perhaps the plan was to lure possible investigators inside and only then destroy everything. While Ariel tried to understand the plan, Bella reminded her her that this was not the time for theories. They needed to get out immediately. Ariel replied that they were merely magical explosives and that academy professors would not be defeated so easily by something of that level. She then created a magic circle on the ground and ordered everyone to remain inside it. The entire dome collapsed over them. In the next instant, however, Ariel teleported everyone outside along with part of the evidence, including the capsules. The people being held prisoner for use in the experiments were also safely transported out of the laboratory. Bella admitted that she truly thought they would not survive. Gray Lee replied that they had indeed escaped by a very narrow margin. Ariel explained that there had been more weight than she expected, so the teleportation took a little longer. Even so, the effort had been worth it. Once that evidence was presented to the Academy, no one could continue pretending that nothing had happened. The following morning, the group brought all the evidence directly to the Academy director. He informed them that the rescued survivors were already receiving treatment in the medical wing. Orodron Alexandro personally thanked the group for putting an end to the illegal experiments conducted by Varian. He also explained that each of those magical machines was worth more than an entire country's annual budget. Ariel emphasized that they had found 8 of them. It was impossible to believe that Varian had obtained such expensive equipment on his own. The director revealed that the equipment had been stolen during a transport operation in which 78 agents had lost their lives. Ariel immediately asked whether it was connected to the incident from 15 years earlier. Orodron confirmed it. The cargo that disappeared during that incident had been carrying those exact magical engines. Those responsible were the Bloodsuckers, the world's largest criminal organization, known for constantly resurfacing and causing new problems. Bella showed deep anger upon hearing the organization's name, since the Bloodsuckers had been responsible for her parents' deaths. The director remarked that they could wipe them out countless times and they would still return. No one knew where their base was or even who truly led the organization. The Bloodsuckers were connected to more than 707 deaths of important figures. Orodron did not rule out the possibility that one of their members had already infiltrated the Academy, especially since identifying them was almost impossible. Confused, Gray Lee asked why the Academy did not simply expel any criminals discovered among its members. Ariel explained that the Academy offered opportunities to anyone with talent, regardless of origin, race, or gender. Orodron added that this principle also applied to those with criminal records. Bella considered that absurd and said criminals should be held accountable for their own actions. The director personally agreed, but made it clear that the Academy's higher authorities did not necessarily share that opinion. Bella asked how that was possible if he was the director. Orodron explained that despite his title, he was merely a subordinate and possessed far less authority than it seemed. If they wanted to discover who truly controlled the Academy, they would need to become stronger. The more value they demonstrated, the greater access they would gain to the institution's inner areas. With that, they would also uncover increasingly greater secrets. Orodron could not reveal names, but mentioned a veteran influential enough to alter the course of the entire Academy. Even the controversial policy of accepting criminals had been created by him. Gray Lee then asked whether surpassing that man in power would allow them to change the rules. Orodron replied that it would. Within that Academy, strength and influence were directly connected. Even so, he found it curious that Ariel had been unable to defeat Varian alone. That meant one of the students had played a decisive role. As always, Ariel's divine eye had chosen well. Orodron became curious to see how far that extraordinary student could go. As he walked through the corridors and observed the arm affected by the shadows, Gray Lee concluded that if power ruled the Academy, he would have to follow that exact path. To defeat the Liquidator and uncover what was truly happening behind the scenes, he would have to focus all his efforts on becoming stronger. While he was lost in those thoughts, one of the students suddenly appeared and struck him with a kick. The provocateur accused Gray Lee of walking around the Academy as though he were important. According to him, a reject from the special admission program should not even be in that corridor. Gray Lee realized this was just another person who looked down on special students and asked whether he was looking for trouble. The young man replied that he would have loved to continue, but gave up after noticing that the rejects professor had arrived and decided to avoid further trouble. As he walked away, he mentally apologized to Professor Varian. Security was too tight for him to get close to Gray Lee, but he intended to send someone else soon. When Ariel approached, she remarked that unfortunately there was little she could do, since the student carried no weapon and Gray Lee showed no visible injuries. She said Gray Lee could find the young man and settle the score, although as a professor she could not officially allow it. Curiously, her eyesight had been worsening because she had been straining her eyes too much. Therefore, perhaps she simply would not see anything if something happened. Even so, Gray Lee preferred not to cause any more trouble. Ariel asked whether students admitted through the Divine Eye's special program were treated that badly. Gray Lee explained that the taunts were common, but this had been the first physical attack. Ariel apologized and regretted not having enough authority to prevent it. Gray Lee replied that she did not need to blame herself, since without her help he would not even have entered the Academy. Besides, he believed Bella and the others would prove that the Divine Eye program had not been a mistake. After all, her potential would be confirmed in the future. Ariel warned Gray Lee not to treat it as someone else's problem. Among all the members of that special group, he was the one who received most of her attention. She hoped that the students of that generation, like those before them, would rise to prominent positions. However, there was something different about Gray Lee. It was only after meeting him that Ariel truly began to believe someone could surpass humanity's own limits. Gray Lee found those words quite heavy. That expectation placed an enormous responsibility on his shoulders. Even so, relying on them alone would not be enough. The mastermind behind Varian probably still intended to continue the plans to summon the Liquidator. In the future, even that powerful group had barely managed to injure the enemy. Gray Lee had returned to the past precisely to ensure the Liquidator's defeat and protect humanity's future. In the next swordsmanship class, the students would take part in a practical combat exercise. They had to form pairs according to the list written on the board. Gray Lee decided to stay alert. If he made any mistake now, everyone would start speaking badly about the students chosen by the Divine Eye. At the very least, he needed to show that he could keep up with the others and improve Professor Ariel's reputation in the process. The problem was that his partner was none other than Leonhard Hartapius, the best first-year student. The professor said he had paired students of similar ability and ordered them to fight as though it were a real battle. Gray Lee thought the claim about similar levels was absurd. He had only just entered the academy and already had to face the best student in the class. Leonhard already disliked the Divine Eye students and probably still held a grudge over what had happened during magic class. But then, Leonhard placed a hand on Gray Lee's shoulder and cheerfully said that he was very happy they had been paired together. Gray Lee thought that bright smile was almost too enthusiastic. Leonhard seemed genuinely delighted to have the chance to fight him without any issues. Even so, he replied that he was also looking forward to the match. As soon as the fight began, Leonhard attacked without hesitation. His strikes were clearly faster and more powerful than Gray Lee's. Even so, Gray Lee's counterattacks made Leonhard admit that he was strong. It was difficult to believe that someone at that level had failed to enter through regular admission. The duel continued at a rapid pace, growing increasingly intense. Gray Lee had expected to lose almost immediately, but he was surprised by his own endurance, a result of the training he had received. Even so, Leonhard's technique was impressive. His style perfectly followed the fundamentals of swordsmanship taught to nobles and appeared exceptionally refined. It was exactly the level expected of a true noble. Leonhard was clearly extraordinary, and the duel became so captivating that the other students stopped fighting to watch. He said he could keep going like that all day. Gray Lee knew that although he had managed to defend himself so far, he still had not created a single opportunity to attack. On top of that, his stamina would not last forever. Without Professor Hathcote's training, he would have collapsed long ago. Leonhard, however, did not even look tired. Gray Lee knew he had to act and finish this quickly. He then avoided the next attack with a low and unexpected maneuver. Immediately afterward, he struck one of Leonhard's legs. If he could not win conventionally, he would have to use another strategy. While there is a pause, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out the membership club to support our team and this content. Also join the Discord to receive video notifications. Now we can return to the story. The blow caught Leonhard completely off guard. At that moment, he realized that Gray Lee was treating this as a genuine battle. Even so, Leonhard had no intention of accepting defeat either. Then, at the very last moment, the two ended up with their swords positioned against each other's necks. Gray Lee concluded that it should be considered a draw. Leonhard stood up with his help and replied that it was not quite like that. In that final instant, all he had managed to do was move his sword on reflex. Gray Lee, on the other hand, could have struck a vital point if he had wanted to, but since it was only training, he chose to aim for the neck instead. Gray Lee replied that even with protective spells, aiming directly at someone's chest during training would have been excessive. Leonhard then admitted that he had lost. Thanks to Gray Lee, he had finally realized the difference between a real battle and a simple swordsmanship practice match. Gray Lee remarked that it seemed a little unfair. Leonhard replied that the instructor himself had told them to treat the duel like a real fight, and in that kind of situation, there was no such thing as cheating. Then he asked for another round. Gray Lee knew he had only won because he had caught Leonhard off guard. If they fought again in a more direct manner, he probably would not stand a chance. It was not even merely a matter of technique, since Leonhard's physical endurance was far above his own. At that moment, a large student approached and said that real battle or not, this was still a swordsmanship class. According to him, no one had permitted them to use anything besides their swords. He also questioned how a special admission student had managed to face the best in the class and told Gray Lee not to act superior just because he knew magic. Gray Lee thought that he had not even chosen that matchup. Leonhard replied that the professor had considered Gray Lee worthy of facing him and told the student not to interfere. The professor then clarified that he himself had arranged all the pairings. He explained that he had matched students of similar strength and that Gray Lee was the only one capable of facing Leonhard. If the other student disagreed, he was free to try defeating Gray Lee himself. The large student accepted. After all, he had also defeated an examiner to enter the academy and had no intention of being compared to someone who had merely ended in a draw. Leonhard realized that the student was judging Gray Lee solely by his admission method without knowing his true strength. It reminded him of his own behavior in the past, but it also seemed like a good opportunity. After all, Leonhard believed that Gray Lee's strength deserved to be recognized by everyone. More importantly, that guy had interrupted the time Leonhardt had been enjoying with Gray Lee. For that reason alone, he was already extremely irritated. The other student did not understand why Leonhardt seemed so annoyed. The professor then explained that if they disliked the rules of real combat, they could fight using only swords. Gray Lee was not certain whether he could really win that way, especially because he knew nothing about the strength of this new opponent. At first glance, the young man appeared physically stronger than him. Even after the brutal training with his master, Gray Lee had not been able to fully compensate for years of good nutrition and physical development. The professor reminded them that this was still only a practical class and asked both of them not to use excessive force. At that moment, under Professor Alvarado's supervision, the two began preparing for the confrontation. The larger student charged forward using all his strength. However, Gray Lee's technique was clearly superior. He responded to the attack without difficulty, because to Gray Lee, the young man's strikes did not even seem as powerful as he had expected. Perhaps his opponent was still holding back at that moment. However, on the next attack, Gray Lee managed to defeat him with ease. The student ended up injured, and the professor immediately declared the fight over. Gray Lee realized that he had hurt the young man and asked whether he was all right. He had intended to strike the sword, but the flat of his blade ended up hitting the student's face. The student demanded a rematch, claiming he had been caught off guard. His classmates thought the blow had looked painful, but the professor allowed them to continue until he was satisfied. Even so, he ended up being defeated repeatedly and finished the match badly bruised. The professor finally put an end to it and ordered that he be taken to the infirmary. At the end of class, he announced Gray Lee and Leonhardt as the first-year representatives. He explained that the best freshman would face the second-year champion. The first years had already lost 35 times in a row, and Gray Lee was surprised to learn that the difference between school years was so great. The professor explained that a single year at the academy made an enormous difference. Losing was expected, and simply putting up a good fight would already be impressive. A victory would go down in history, while merely being chosen to participate was already a great honor. Gray Lee then realized that the battle between the classes might not be taken as seriously as he had imagined. Even so, as a student chosen through the Divine Eye special admission, this would be the perfect opportunity to prove his worth. For that reason, he decided to train seriously for the confrontation. Meanwhile, a meeting was taking place at the academy, and the final item on the agenda was the proposal submitted by Professor Boudra. He had proposed expelling Amy White, a student admitted through the Divine Eye special admission program. Professor Boudra belonged to the magic department. Ariel asked why he would make such a proposal, since she was responsible for overseeing the students chosen by the Divine Eye. Boudra replied that this was precisely the problem. Amy White had failed the advancement exam for the third year, yet remained at the academy because of her special admission. Everyone else who failed had been expelled, so that seemed unfair. Ariel countered that Amy White was steadily progressing toward a world-class combat level. At present, the severe strain on her own body prevented Amy from displaying her full ability. Without that limitation, Ariel believed she would have passed. One of the professors questioned that explanation. Suddenly, a student considered useless was being treated as hidden talent, as though Ariel insisted on believing in secret abilities. Ariel replied that the academy was supposed to provide room for exactly that kind of growth. If they pressured Amy too much now, they could destroy that possibility forever. The professor retorted that Ariel had already used that same justification before. To him, her plan seemed to be keeping someone who failed to meet the required standards at the academy indefinitely. Ariel knew that the academy's purpose was to cultivate extraordinary talent. Expelling someone promising simply because they didn't fit the rules perfectly went against that purpose. That was when the discussion took a different direction. Some claimed that the Great Divine Eye had lost its accuracy, and even suggested shutting down the program entirely. The system had been created long ago by the Founders' Council, but it could also be abolished if more than half the faculty agreed. They also said that, frankly, the current students chosen by the Divine Eye weren't impressing anyone. Boudra acknowledged that Bella Albrecht had improved considerably, but he didn't consider it anything extraordinary. Furthermore, her mana capacity still raised doubts. They argued that previous students selected by the Divine Eye had been exceptional, while the current generation failed to make the same impression. Ariel realized that far more professors opposed the Divine Eye than she had imagined. If this continued, the program could truly be abolished. Boudra insisted that the system was already outdated and that the time had come to move on. He then provoked Ariel by asking whether she believed her judgment of talent was superior to that of every other professor. Ariel thought that, deep down, she did believe that, but she knew saying it aloud would only provoke everyone present even more. Many already disliked her. Even so, several professors genuinely cared about whether the program benefited the academy. If she wanted to gain their support, Ariel needed to avoid making any comment that could turn them further against her. When she remained silent, however, the others took the opportunity to provoke her even more. Even so, Ariel continued to trust her ability to recognize genuine talent. The problem was that those children still needed more time to mature. Given enough time, they would certainly prove their worth. Ariel only needed to prevent them from being expelled before that opportunity came. One professor then pointed out that Gray Lee was also part of the Divine Eye program. According to him, the boy was promising and had been chosen for the interclass battle. Boudra seized on that observation and asked why they didn't let Gray Lee prove his worth in that very competition. That way, they could decide the future of the Divine Eye program after evaluating his performance. Professor Hathcote discreetly signaled to Ariel that this This didn't seem like an appropriate decision. When Ariel refused, the professors began pressuring her again. They said that if Gray Lee couldn't demonstrate his ability in training, he wouldn't be able to do so in a real fight either. Ariel said they didn't understand the situation. Gray Lee's abilities didn't work like conventional swordsmanship. The headmaster decided to end the discussion since they were getting nowhere. Even so, he considered it reasonable to personally observe the performance of the student chosen by the Divine Eye. It was decided that they would watch Gray Lee in the interclass battle and only afterward determine the program's fate. With that, the meeting ended. Naturally, Half-Core was deeply concerned about the situation. Ariel, meanwhile, felt powerless. She didn't even possess enough authority to protect her own students. She knew very well that Gray Lee's true power was poorly suited to simulated battles. He still needed time. Even so, Ariel realized that Gray Lee now had to carry the future of the program on his shoulders. The boy would also have to defend the future of the other children who possessed the potential to reach world-class level. Then the appointed day for the interclass battle arrived. Once again, the arena was summoned in the center of the main square. Among the participants was Leonhardt, considered the best first-year student. Representing the second year was Lionel Hartman, the most outstanding student in that class. Gray Lee was introduced as the first-year challenger. The second-year challenger was Dibble Haddart. Gray Lee recognized that strange man connected to Professor Varian, the same one who had suddenly attacked him in the corridor. The professor in charge announced that the competition would reveal what each participant was truly capable of. The faculty members who supported abolishing the Divine Eye program were also present, watching everything while placing even more pressure on Ariel. The students themselves didn't understand why so many professors had appeared to watch the competition. Leonhardt remarked that they were probably curious about Gray Lee and said that, if so, they had excellent taste. The second-year student found that attitude strange, since Leonhardt normally didn't behave that way. One of the professors confirmed that the guess was correct. According to him, everyone there would witness the battle that could determine the future of the Divine Eye special admission program. The students became confused and began wondering exactly what he meant by that. The professors then asked in surprise whether no one had told the students about the situation. The Divine Eye program was on the verge of being abolished. Ariel couldn't answer. She feared that if Gray Lee learned the whole truth, he might push himself far beyond what was necessary. He might even try to draw upon that power again, but in his current condition he couldn't do so safely. Ariel then said that Boudreaux was merely trying to distract Gray Lee and told him not to let those words affect his performance. But he noticed that she was trembling. Even so, he replied that it was fine, if that was what she said. The professors believed that once she suffered a humiliating defeat, everyone would finally understand just how much the Divine Eye program had declined. After all, her vision was no longer as accurate as it had once been. Gray Lee, however, said he could not simply ignore that. They could insult him as much as they wanted, but they should not belittle Professor Ariel's judgment. Boudreaux then asked what kind of potential the Divine Eye had seen in that boy. Unlike Ariel, the others, who were still keeping a cool head, seemed certain that Gray Lee would end up losing disgracefully. Gray simply replied that he would show everyone how wrong they were. The participants began preparing alongside their respective teammates. Ariel liked Gray Lee's confidence, but suspected that he might be considering resorting to something dangerous. If he were facing only the best swordsmanship student, his practical experience might have given him at least a small chance. The problem was that he had ended up facing a terrible opponent. That opponent was Dibble. Varian had surgically altered his brain directly. The procedure had raised his reflexes far beyond human limits, practically turning him into a living weapon. He was exactly the worst kind of opponent for Gray Lee's surprise attacks. Ariel feared that the boy was thinking about using that ability. For that reason, she told him not to worry about her and to avoid pushing his body beyond its limits. Gray replied that he understood perfectly. Then the time came for the battle between the top students to begin. The representatives of both teams stepped into the arena. The battlefield was protected by magic to prevent anyone from suffering fatal injuries. The protection would also determine defeat, but the participants still had to fight as though they were in a real battle. As soon as the duel began, Leonhardt took the initiative. At first, the two exchanged blows on fairly even terms. Even so, Lionel gave off a far more intimidating presence. Leonhardt even combined his swordsmanship techniques with hand-to-hand combat movements. Lionel acknowledged that he was good and even stronger than he had been in his first year. However, he warned that he would now raise the pace to second-year level. Leonhardt came under so much pressure that he could barely react until he was thrown against the barrier surrounding the arena. The protection activated, ending the duel and confirming Lionel's victory. Next would come the battle between the challengers. As he passed Gray Lee, Leonhardt wished him good luck. Gray stepped into the arena thinking that after talking so much, he now had to make sure he won. Before going back in time, he had already faced more terrifying monsters than he could remember. Compared to that, this challenge seemed minor. Dibble, on the other hand, promised to send Gray Lee to the same place where Varian was, Hell. As soon as the fight began, Gray Lee immediately went on the attack. Dibble, however, answered with an extremely heavy counterattack. Ariel had already warned Gray that his opponent's reflexes had been surgically enhanced. But Dibble also displayed impressive strength. Gray still possessed the power of the shadows, but Ariel had forbidden him from using it because the backlash could put his own life at risk. The tournament was important, but it did not justify such danger. Besides, the arena barrier might not even withstand that ability, potentially putting his opponent at risk as well. Even so, Gray Lee was willing to risk a great deal to protect the Divine Eye slot. After all, it could truly change the future, he knew. There was only one clear limit. He could not put someone's life at risk during a school tournament. Up to that point, however, Dibble continued advancing with strangely simple attacks. Gray realized that he had to be preparing something, and Dibble was doing all of it with a huge smile on his face. He seemed to have completely lowered his guard against Gray Lee, but, in truth, he had deliberately avoided striking one of the boy's vital areas. Ariel immediately noticed that through her divine eye. She also saw something hidden inside Dibble, a strange dark flame. Meanwhile, the other professors commented that the match was far too one-sided. They said that second-year student had an unpleasant personality, but even so, he seemed well on his way to victory. Gray Lee was already struggling just to block the attacks. Even though he refused to give in, he also could not find an opening to counterattack. Boudreaux remarked that at this rate, the whole issue of the special slots would only become an even bigger mess if they kept waiting. Ariel then demanded that they stop the fight immediately. The situation was becoming dangerous. Boudreaux asked why and mockingly wondered whether it was simply because her student was about to lose. Others said that Ariel simply did not know how to accept defeat. After all, thanks to the barrier, the students could fight seriously without fear. Unless, of course, she had some other reason for wanting to stop the match. Ariel knew the protection spell perfectly well, but she also knew that it would not be enough to protect Gray Lee. However, the warning came too late. Dibble finally released the power that had been sealed inside his body, a force that had been placed there by Varian himself. Suddenly, an enormous blast of dark flames was unleashed. The impact was so intense that it tore open a large fissure in the arena floor. And to everyone's surprise, the protective barrier failed to block that energy. Ariel had already warned them about the danger, but the other professors had not believed her. Furious, Ariel realized that Varian had implanted that power in the student and was still causing trouble even after his death. She tried to intervene with magic, but the spectator's barrier prevented her from reaching Dibble. He warned the others that it was an emergency and that they needed to bring down the barrier immediately. However, the professors were so shaken by the situation that, for a few moments, they could not react. Ariel ordered the fight to be stopped and told Gray Lee to get out of there. But Gray Lee knew that if he turned his back at that moment, he might not survive. Dibble's shadow attacks were so threatening that everyone nearby began fearing the worst. Half-Coach knew the spells would take too long to reach him. With no other choice, he decided to trust that Gray Lee was already prepared for this. In his opinion, Gray Lee was still capable of winning that confrontation. He then explained that he should imagine his own body as a sword. Instead of swinging it, he needed to move his entire body through that power. Gray Lee thought the instruction had come far too suddenly, especially in such a dangerous situation. Even so, if the professor believed he could do it, he would try. Gray Lee focused his mind and imagined himself completely merged with the blade. He gathered all his strength into that movement and directly confronted the next shadow attack launched by Dibble. In an instant, he appeared behind his opponent through an unexpected charge. His speed had increased dramatically. He was far faster, enough to surpass even Dibble's reflexes. Gray Lee then unleashed a strike wrapped in his own shadow aura. The force of the attack was so great that it even pierced through the arena's protection. As a result, Dibble was thrown out of the combat area. Half-Coach became genuinely worried about the other student. Although he cared more about Gray Lee, he was still a professor and concerned for both of them. Even after being examined by the judge, Dibble managed to stand up again, looking terrifying. He seemed to have suffered no damage at all, while uncontrolled shadow energy spread around him, threatening to consume everything. Bolts, threads, and structures formed from shadows began spreading throughout the building and taking over the surroundings. To make matters worse, the arena barrier was still active. The professors were doing everything they could to deactivate it as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, Dibble continued attacking in a completely uncontrolled manner. Gray Lee was also far from an ordinary person, but this exceeded every reasonable limit. He kept dodging the attacks, but Dibble was able to follow his movements with steadily increasing speed. What truly began harming Gray Lee was the excessive and reckless use of his own ability. His body began showing severe signs of strain. Even so, he knew he had to keep responding in order to survive. With no alternative, Gray Lee once again drew upon that power and released the shadows that remained within him. With his next strike, he managed to hit Dibble with enough force to disable both of his arms. As a result, the remaining shadow energy trapped inside Dibble's body began to be released. As soon as the barrier finally fell, Ariel immediately entered the arena. She used her magic to seal the body of the boy who had undergone surgery. Gray Lee was also in terrible condition, suffering from severe internal bleeding caused by the extreme strain. Ariel quickly cast a spell and managed to stabilize his condition. Shortly afterward, Gray Lee was already back on his feet. Surprised, the judge asked whether he truly felt all right. Ariel examined Gray Lee with the divine eye and concluded that despite using so much power, his soul remained completely intact. The healing magic had also restored his body, so he apparently no longer had any serious injuries. Half Coach remarked that, just as he had predicted, they had managed to greatly reduce the impact of the backlash. Ariel immediately disagreed. In her view, it had been far from merely reduced impact, because without healing magic, Gray Lee could have suffered fatal consequences. The Half Coach explained that they had managed to keep the injuries within what magic could heal. However, it would still take time before he could withstand a counterattack on his own. Gray Lee asked whether that insane training was meant to help him endure his own power. Ariel commented that, either way, several things had happened in ways no one had expected. Dibble was being taken away, and she wanted to confirm something. It concerned the judge. The protective barrier of the second-year representative, Dibble, had been activated by Gray Lee's attack. Since Gray Lee's barrier had not been triggered, he was declared the winner. It went down in history. A first-year student had finally defeated a second-year representative. Leonhardt said that he expected nothing less from Lord Gray Lee. Half Coach added that, thanks to that victory, the Divine Eye student had ended the first year's streak of 35 consecutive defeats. The number of wins and losses no longer mattered. After that fight, no one could say Ariel had misjudged him. Even the director acknowledged it, and no one would support the proposal to abolish the Divine Eye special class anymore. Some teachers even said they should be ashamed for having considered abolishing it. The academy had nearly lost an extraordinary talent. Because of that, Ariel sincerely thanked Gray Lee. As for Budra's group, who had been advocating for the abolition of the Divine Eye special class, their reputation had suffered considerably. In the end, they simply slipped away from the situation. That old saying still held true. Never cause trouble with the Divine Eye. Times might have changed, but that rule remained true. Gray Lee began to wonder whether something had happened to Ariel in the past. Perhaps that was the reason. Shortly afterward, the director approached Gray Lee to discuss a very important matter. It was something that greatly concerned him. During the previous match, the representative Dibble had clearly displayed an abnormality. An unusual power had been forcibly implanted into his body. A battle simulation that should have been completely safe had ended up placing the students in serious danger. Because of that, the director sincerely apologized to Gray Lee. The academy accepted full responsibility for failing to detect that abnormality. Gray Lee replied that there was no need to apologize, since nothing had happened to him in the end. The director explained that after Dibble entered that berserker state, Gray Lee had also unleashed something unusual. It did not seem like magic, but an entirely different force. It was a kind of power that even modern magical theory could not analyze. He then asked whether Gray Lee could explain exactly what it was. Gray Lee knew he could not reveal his regression, especially while he still did not know where those responsible for the conspiracy were hiding. So he simply replied that he had no idea what it was. Even he had not known he could produce such an effect. That was when Professor Ariel realized what was happening and decided to intervene. She thought he was an excellent liar, since Gray Lee had already used that same power when he defeated the Ogre General. For now, Gray Lee only needed her to go along with his story. It was necessary so they could deal with the Liquidator. Ariel was surprised when she realized just how much that boy trusted her. She then approached the director and confirmed that Gray Lee was telling the truth. Ariel explained that Gray Lee's power could not be understood through magical theory. Even so, her eyes could see it clearly. She was still researching a proper way to extract and understand that power. Therefore, she asked whether the director could leave all matters related to Gray Lee's ability in her hands. The director replied that after witnessing that fight, he had no reason to deny her request. The entire Divine Eye special group was already under her care. If she needed any support from the academy, all she had to do was ask. Ariel thanked him for his trust, even showing a hint of surprise. After that, they decided to head to the underground medical wing. They needed to examine Dibble's condition, and Ariel's special eyes would be indispensable for that. Later, Ariel met with Gray Lee in her office and explained that the power implanted in Dibble was practically identical to the one used by the Liquidator. Even the ingredients and crystals used were the same as those found at the research center. After everything that had happened, Dibble ultimately did not survive. Ariel made it clear that this had not been caused by Gray Lee's actions. The moment that power was activated, Dibble was no longer himself. In truth, his fate had been sealed from the moment that force was implanted in him. The real target was Gray Lee. Everything had been retaliation for what happened to Varian. Gray Lee concluded that if Dibble had been manipulated after Varian's death, then it could only have been the work of the third group. Ariel replied that there was certainly someone important behind everything. She would continue searching for information through her contacts, although she knew it would take time. Even so, her intuition told her that people from the deepest levels of the academy were involved. Gray Lee then offered to help if there was anything he could do. Ariel, however, said that he had already done more than enough. Then she returned to the subject of his power. She explained that Gray Lee had learned to use that force without harming his own soul, which was excellent progress. He agreed, although the impact on his body had been even greater than before. Even so, he preferred physical damage over endangering his soul. Ariel told him not to worry. She and Hathcote had already decided to advance his training to the next stage. This time, Gray Lee would learn to control that power far better than he had been able to until then. Sometime later, he was back in the arena. The entire place was completely filled with training dummies. The half-coach knew there was hardly any need to warn him, but made it clear that this training method would be dangerous and extremely painful. If Gray Lee was willing to take longer to improve, there were much safer alternatives. But Gray Lee was not willing to take the slower path. So he prepared himself, focused his mind, and drew a deep breath. He needed to become one with the blade. Gray Lee recalled the sensation from the moment he had summoned the dark aura. Then he charged across the arena, destroying every training dummy as quickly as he could. The other teachers immediately noticed how fast he was and could not hide their surprise. The half-coach, however, kept all his attention focused on the possible backlash. A short while later, the effect struck Gray Lee with full force. Numerous injuries began appearing across his body, and even his eyes showed signs of the tremendous strain. Even so, he kept pushing himself until he finally collapsed. At that moment, the mage instructors nearby immediately activated their recovery spells. After receiving treatment, Gray Lee managed to stand again, now free of the most serious injuries. The half-coach remarked that he was progressing very well and had endured far more than during his previous attempt. With enough repetition, his body would begin resisting the impact better. Since that method trained pure endurance, it was only natural for it to be so painful. Gray Lee admitted that using that power caused excruciating pain. For the instructor, however, all that pain meant he was surpassing his own limits. Even so, the decision to continue or stop belonged solely to Gray Lee. Without hesitation, Gray Lee asked to try one more time. That was when Ariel appeared and warned that this kind of training would only be permitted once a day. Physical injuries could be treated with recovery magic. However, suffering another serious injury before the nerves stabilized could have consequences. It could end up confusing his senses when he tried to wield a sword. Gray Lee understood that problem better than anyone, especially after the period when his arm had been injured. The half-coach remarked that, to be fair, it was also a relief, since all those training dummies were quite expensive. One of the mages then asked why they were in such a hurry to strengthen Gray Lee. After all, he was already exceptionally powerful for a first-year student. Ariel replied that it was her fault. She was the one who had involved Gray Lee in the fight against Varian, and now the people behind him considered the boy an enemy. More enemies would certainly appear. Even if they hid Gray Lee somewhere extremely secure, Ariel was not certain they could keep him safe. Therefore, the simplest way to increase his chances of survival was to make him even stronger. Gray Lee asked them not to blame themselves. Stopping the Liquidator's experiment had been his own decision. Ariel said that he was an exceptional student and that, at that moment, all she could do was help him grow stronger. Ariel and Hathcote then began discussing the fastest and safest way to strengthen a swordsman. To Hathcote, changing swords was clearly the most immediate solution. Gray Lee asked whether the weapon provided by the Academy was not already a high-quality custom sword. Ariel explained that normally, that sword would be more than enough for any freshman. Unfortunately, it could not withstand the full extent of Gray Lee's power, and on closer inspection, the sword he was using was already practically destroyed. For that reason, Ariel decided to take him directly to her private vault. Hathcote asked whether she truly intended to give one of her weapons to Gray Lee. Ariel replied that everything there was available to him. Then Ariel turned a key directly in the air. A magical door appeared before them, while Ariel stated that Gray Lee had already proven himself worthy of that privilege. As soon as he entered the vault, Gray Lee was completely astonished. The place was overflowing with gold, treasures, weapons, and countless valuable objects. They headed directly toward the section reserved for swords. Ariel's vault was so enormous that it had to be divided into several sections. Gray Lee noticed that every sword there radiated a threatening presence. Even Hathcote admitted that he would be hard-pressed to find such an extensive collection anywhere else. Ariel remarked that choosing among so many options was truly difficult. Ideally, they would test each sword using Gray Lee's full strength. However, due to the nature of that power, they could only perform one such test per day. So they decided to set aside several weapons and try them gradually. Ariel began by handing him the sharpest sword in the collection. As soon as he took the weapon, Gray Lee realized that it was quite heavy. Ariel then conjured a wooden target so he could test it. Gray Lee delivered a single strike, destroying not only the training target. Part of the floor was struck as well. The sword truly possessed tremendous power, though it might have been too heavy for him. The half-coach reminded him that it did not matter how sharp a blade was. If the wielder could not hit the target, it was not very useful. Even so, against enormous and durable enemies, such as large beasts or structures, that sword could be extremely useful. Ariel added that she would also give him a storage bag, so Gray Lee would not need to carry that heavy weapon all the time. Gray Lee asked whether that sword was not far too valuable to simply lend to someone. Ariel replied that it was better to see it being used than to let it continue gathering dust. A weapon of that caliber should belong to someone capable of wielding it. Besides, when Gray Lee finally faced those responsible for Varian and the Liquidator, he might deeply regret not having that sword with him. Lee sincerely thanked Ariel for allowing him to use such a valuable weapon. Hathcote advised him to avoid showing that sword to others unless he genuinely intended to use it. After all, if that weapon were put up for sale, it would probably fetch at least 10 billion. Lee was shocked when he heard the price and said he could not accept something so expensive. Ariel, however, refused to take it back. It was not a loan, she was truly giving the sword to him. If she could protect the future of the Divine Eye by spending only 10 billion, Ariel would do it without a second thought. Besides, that sword was a reward Lee had yet to receive. It was a way to reward him for everything he had done. Ariel insisted that he accept it, and Lee eventually agreed, promising to take very good care of the sword. Even so, Ariel still wanted to find another weapon that Lee could use normally in ordinary battles. Lee had never imagined Ariel's private treasury would be so impressive. Hathcote remarked that no one in the world possessed eyes as precise as hers. Thanks to the Divine Eye, Ariel could earn practically as much money as she wanted. She then asked the half-coach, as Lee's instructor, which sword he considered the most suitable. He pointed toward a sword with a slender blade and golden hilt, much lighter and more agile than the previous weapon. The weight seemed ideal, and the craftsmanship was excellent. Even so, Lee felt that something about it did not suit him. The half-coach agreed that the sword did not seem suitable for him. He then remembered another one, originally created for an experiment, that might be a better match for Lee. It was a sword covered in crystals, from which an intense magical aura emanated. It began to glow the moment it reached Lee's hands. Stranger still, it had no edge. The half-coach explained that the sword was a prototype created to test new technology, not a weapon designed for actual combat. Although it was more than just a blunt bar of steel, its durability was impressive. Perhaps it was exactly the right sword for him. He asked whether, considering all the power he possessed, he truly needed a sharpened sword. The master replied that it was not actually necessary. With that much power, any sword would eventually give way, and if he kept growing stronger, even the finest weapons might fail to keep up with him. In the future, they might become nothing more than a burden. Lee needed to prepare himself to fight without relying on a sword's edge. To demonstrate its durability, he struck a steel structure and showed that the sword remained completely intact. The structure he struck, however, was completely deformed and destroyed. Ariel remarked that she still preferred seeing Lee wield a bladed sword. If he wanted to try other kinds of weapons, there were several options available. Either way, he wanted to try everything there. Some swords were noticeably lighter, while others carried considerable weight. Then his attention settled on an extremely thin sword, almost like a needle. As he examined it more closely, he had the strange impression that he had seen it before. Ariel explained that it had been left behind by a former student after graduation. It was not a famous sword, but its craftsmanship was exceptional. The moment he held the weapon, he noticed how comfortable it felt. It fit his hand perfectly. His first strike came out perfectly clean, as though he had trained with that sword his entire life. Lee had never encountered a sword so simple and comfortable to wield. Ariel suggested that they also conduct a test to determine whether the sword was compatible with his power. Lee hesitated and asked whether it belonged to her former student, worried that he might break it. Ariel assured him that it was fine. In her eyes, the sword would surely prefer to be used again rather than continue gathering dust in some corner. Curious, Lee then asked for the name of the student who had created the sword. She replied that his name was Medellin Norum, now known as the greatest magical blacksmith in the world. Lee was surprised to discover that the sword had actually been created by him. The next day, he returned to intensive training, with several dummies prepared for another session. Ariel considered the training a perfect opportunity to put the new swords to the test. Lee decided to begin with the experimental sword. The moment he grasped it, he began the test. However, the instant he tried to use his power, the sword fell apart. He tried again, concentrating more carefully this time, but the result was the same, and the weapon broke once more. Ariel asked whether he had noticed any change in his physical condition. Lee replied that he had not. In that case, Ariel concluded that the problem probably lay with the sword itself and suggested setting it aside. Perhaps the prototype simply was not compatible with Lee's special powers. With that, Ariel decided to bring out the sword created by Medellin Norum. It was the extremely thin weapon whose blade resembled a needle. As he wielded it, he seemed perfectly synchronized with the blade and managed to activate his power without difficulty. At that moment, however, a voice emerged, saying something about making the most of the time while there was still a chance. Lee clearly realized that he was hearing a voice at that moment. The half-coach remarked that activating his power with that sword apparently would not be a problem. Lee then charged forward to attack the numerous dummies scattered throughout the training area. His movements flowed with astonishing smoothness and ease. Even his body seemed much lighter as he moved. The mages quickly noticed that his performance was completely different from the previous test. It was almost as though he were flying as he advanced, striking every target along the way. When he finished, he was still standing despite facing exactly the same number of targets as before. Previously, he had reached only half the targets before collapsing. Now he had overcome them all and still had energy to spare. Surprised, Ariel asked how he was still able to remain standing after such tremendous exertion. Lee had not noticed it, but he had suffered a deep wound from his chest to his abdomen. Only after releasing the sword did he begin to feel the pain. Even recovery magic was not enough, and his strength was beginning to fade rapidly. Ariel explained that such blood loss would drain his stamina even with healing magic. For that reason, he needed to rest immediately. Hathcote observed that Gray Lee had finally surpassed a limit that had previously seemed impossible. To him, that was an excellent sign. Ariel agreed, but warned that continuing to move without noticing his own physical condition could also be extremely dangerous. In a real battle, especially without someone nearby who could heal him, he would need to act with far greater caution. Even after all that exertion, the sword remained completely unscathed. Its durability was truly remarkable. Ariel then noticed a different, more intense glow coming from the sword. Soon afterward, she suddenly sensed an unusual presence or energy. The next instant, something struck the Academy's main building directly. The mages were mobilized immediately and raised barriers to protect the building, while the students descended into panic. The half-coach reported that the point of impact corresponded exactly to the area where the vault containing dangerous materials was located. Given the circumstances, it was obvious that the explosion had been deliberately caused by someone. He also briefly detected traces of teleportation magic. This raised the possibility that someone had stolen something from the Academy headquarters in broad daylight. The mages considered that impossible. The vault had powerful protection against teleportation, and its walls had been built to withstand most explosive spells. Ariel detected liquidator energy mixed into the smoke. They had probably used crystals from the underground laboratory to breach the outer wall and neutralize the anti-teleportation field. Varian's allies caused that explosion and struck the Academy headquarters in broad daylight. Later, after investigating and analyzing what had happened, Ariel explained that, just as they had suspected, several items had been taken from the vault. Although the details had not been revealed, it was not a place where an outsider could cause an explosion so easily. Moreover, they managed to destroy the teleportation inhibitor before escaping, showing that the operation had been meticulously planned. Everything pointed to someone who knew how the vault worked. Perhaps the Academy was no longer a trustworthy organization, or perhaps it never had been. Gray Lee remarked that, if the enemy truly controlled the Academy, they could simply use their influence to take whatever they wanted from the vaults without having to break in. If they had gone so far as to carry out that operation, it meant there was no legal way to obtain whatever they intended to take. Ariel agreed. She knew nothing about her superior's plans, but her main suspicion fell on the bloodsuckers, those vermin who had also infiltrated the Academy. Gray Lee remembered the deep hatred Bella held for them, as they were responsible for her parents' deaths. The professor also warned that, after defeating Varian, Gray Lee might end up becoming one of their next targets. Because of that, Gray Lee needed to remain vigilant, especially whenever he was outside the Academy. When he arrived at his next class, he found everyone visibly nervous and apprehensive. Gray Lee assumed the tense atmosphere was a consequence of the attack. However, that was not the reason. The tension came from the announcement of an outdoor exercise. One of the students asked whether he had read the letter. He replied that he had, yet he seemed completely calm. They would spend 16 hours marching and camping in a region filled with low-level monsters, always accompanied by professors. An entire week of that, along with additional combat training, and he still remained calm. Another student reminded him that no one could guarantee a good night's sleep. They said that every year, more than half the students gave up because of this exercise. Gray Lee replied that, on a real battle march, no one knew when the enemy might attack. At least there was a defined period here. To him, that alone could already be considered a kindness. During the squad's subjugation training, there had been no time limit. They simply dropped them in the mountains and forced them to cross forests overrun with monsters. Some had even lost their lives during those training exercises. This time, however, professors were accompanying the group, so something like that was unlikely to happen. The student was frightened by Gray Lee. Leonhardt remarked that this was typical of him. Not even hellish exercises frightened him, since Gray Lee was already on an entirely different level. Seeing how frightened the others were, Gray Lee sensed that some danger might be waiting outside. That was why he would keep growing stronger. It was exactly what he needed to do. A few days later, Hathcote began the annual outdoor exercise for first-year students. He warned them that it would be quite difficult. Most struggled to complete the exercise, but anyone who gave up would never be able to advance to the second year. Hathcote advised everyone to remain determined to avoid that fate. Then they set out, traveling through the regions near the border of the Wintool continent. The region, however, seemed completely uninhabited, and Gray Lee could not quite understand why. After crossing fields and vast grasslands, they finally reached the forest. Only then did they realize that Hathcote had deliberately been leading the group along the wrong path. After all, it would hardly be training if they followed the easiest route. They continued marching, even though they were already exhausted from walking. Hathcote, however, warned them that they had not even reached the halfway point yet. The students complained, reminding him that this was still only the first day. He assured them that they would all be fine. Their bodies would gradually adapt as they continued, since the beginning was precisely the hardest part. The students immediately said that he was obviously lying. Leonhardt, on the other hand, kept pace without showing practically any sign of fatigue. To Leonhardt, Gray Lee had become a genuine source of inspiration. Suddenly, however, one of the girls was caught off guard by an attack from a spider-like monster. The creature was neutralized almost instantly by a knife thrown by Gray Lee. The girl thanked him, and he merely advised her to watch out for poisonous insects. Gray Lee was not merely marching. He was also carefully watching their surroundings to prevent unexpected attacks. Leonhardt was impressed by his skill. Gray Lee noticed that, for now, his energy remained steady. The training he had undergone before returning to the past was proving extremely useful. Even this exercise was already far better than anything he had endured in the battalion during that hellish experience. Even so, his greatest concern was the possibility of attacks from outside the academy, especially from Varian's allies. He hoped nothing bad would happen, but he would remain prepared in case trouble arose. When they finally reached one of the clearings in the middle of the forest, one of the professors announced that, from that point onward, they would begin a meal preparation training exercise. The students grew excited, thinking they could finally eat and enjoy a short break. Gray Lee, however, felt somewhat uneasy when he heard the phrase meal training. The professor quickly clarified that this would not be a break. During a march, someone had to prepare the food, so the students would be divided into squads. The teams were organized to keep their overall strength balanced. Each squad would receive an area equipped with cooking utensils to prepare its own meal. All the equipment had been summoned through magic, including the board used to display the teams. It showed that Leonhardt would lead Squad C, while command of Squad D would fall to Gray Lee. He did not know whether he could lead well, since he assumed no one would want to follow the special admission student known for the divine eye. However, the students who introduced themselves as members of his team seemed far more relaxed than Gray Lee had expected. Gray Lee asked whether they were truly comfortable having him as their leader. The answer came immediately. After witnessing that match, there was no reason to choose anyone else. To them, Gray Lee was by far the most reliable option. They then began gathering the equipment and all the necessary utensils. Gray Lee then realized just how much the students' attitude towards special admission students had changed. After all, at that academy, merit was what truly mattered. However, one of the students noticed that there was no food among the available equipment and supplies. The professor explained that on a real march, there might not even be food available, much less cooking utensils. Having even a simple pot would already be considered a great privilege. Leonhardt argued that modern field operations should have some logistical support through magical storage. After all, it was difficult to imagine a prolonged march without bringing any food at all. The professor agreed, saying that was correct, but only when it came to operations planned in advance. In an emergency, while camping during combat or after losing whoever was responsible for supplies, they might be forced to undertake a long march without any preparation. Moreover, storage bags were extremely expensive and valuable items. Unless they belonged to a large unit, each of them would have to carry their own equipment on their back. He then asked whether, faced with such a situation, they would simply accept their fate without fighting back. Everyone fell silent beneath the professor's stern gaze. Leonhardt then apologized for his remark. Gray Lee reflected on just how rare those bags were. He had accepted Ariel's thinking it was merely a simple model for storing his sword. The professor, however, said there was no need to worry because he had some good news. Some of them had probably already noticed, but that forest was teeming with monsters. During the march, they had been spreading magical monster repellent, but now they would stop using it. In other words, finding food should not be much of a problem. He then deactivated the magical monster repellent, causing the protection around them to disappear. Gray Lee's group asked what they were supposed to do from that point onward. The professor replied that they would need to hunt monsters for food. In that situation, it was their only option. Gray Lee had carefully observed the path along the way, examining tracks and other signs left behind by the creatures. There were small and medium-sized monsters in that region. In principle, they should be able to fight them using nothing more than a sword. Even so, the students were uneasy about the idea of going straight into real combat. Gray Lee remarked that if they encountered carnivorous monsters, things would be easier. They only needed to wander around the area until some creature was attracted to them and attacked. They themselves would serve as bait to obtain food. If they stayed there, however, they would end up competing for the same prey as the other squads and might go hungry. If they truly did not want to face monsters, they could still resort to insects or even snakes, which could also serve as food. The girl said she would rather hunt monsters. After all, they were already in the middle of a forest full of them. No one liked the idea of eating insects, so naturally, they decided to follow the suggestion of Gray Lee, who was leading the group. Sometime later, they began exploring the area using everything they knew about survival. During the search, Gray Lee found an area frequented by carnivorous creatures. Shortly afterward, a gigantic bear appeared and charged at one of the students. From the looks of it, it almost seemed as though Gray Lee was deliberately putting everyone in danger. While we have a moment, check whether you have already left a like, subscribed to the channel, and turned on notifications because it helps tremendously. Otherwise, I might end up getting sick from worrying so much. So leave a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It costs nothing and gives the channel a huge boost. And seriously, leaving a comment helps a lot too. You can comment, for example, on which moments of the video you like the most. I am using that YouTube feature that lets you mark the exact timestamp for each part of the video. It is a really useful feature and helps the channel a lot without costing anything. Now we can continue with the video, alright? The boy failed to counterattack in time, but at least he escaped the attack. albeit somewhat clumsily. Despite that, he was still a student at the World Union Academy. He managed to strike the creature, but the blow ended up being far too shallow. The one who truly landed the decisive attack was Gray Lee, who severely injured the bear's paw before the creature could reach the other student. The next attack was direct, swift, and precise, ending the confrontation immediately. The other students could hardly believe what they had just witnessed. Gray Lee remarked that the creature's bones were extremely tough and asked whether his classmate was all right. The boy confirmed that he was, thanking Lee for saving him. Gray Lee explained that wild monsters could still move after suffering fatal injuries. Therefore, instead of focusing solely on defeating them, the most important thing was to avoid getting hit. The student replied that he had learned that lesson the hard way. Fighting monsters was completely different from training against other people. Later, while preparing bear stew, they realized that the meat was actually tastier than they had expected. The meat was somewhat tough, but became much more tender after being cooked. Gray Lee explained that the taste of monster meat varied greatly depending on the species. Some species tasted bad, while others could be poisonous. Gray Lee recommended researching local monsters before expeditions and, in unfamiliar regions, looking for creatures similar to wild boars, which were usually safe and tasty. One of the female students remarked that he really knew a lot about the subject and asked whether he had also received survival training. Gray Lee merely replied that he had studied the subject a little. In truth, he preferred not to remember that experience. The others said that even so, he was truly impressive. Sometime later, another group approached and, after apologizing for the interruption, asked whether they could share some of the food. That group's search had not gone very well. They had managed to find only a frog leg and some strange broth of unknown origin, which might not even have been safe to consume. Gray Lee replied that he did not mind sharing, since there was enough food to feed everyone. At that moment, the professor appeared and warned that sharing food was prohibited. If they wanted to eat, they would have to obtain their own food. With no other choice, the unfortunate students returned to what they had managed to gather for their meal. The next day, they did not stop marching until nightfall. Their field camping exercise would begin at that location. At least Gray Lee had managed to eat properly. In that respect, his group was already better off than most. Exhausted after everything they had been through, the students simply dropped to the ground to rest. The professors then distributed the necessary materials, including portable rations and individual tents intended for the students and their respective squads. The groups would remain the same as in the previous exercise. Each team had to collect its supplies and set up its tents and campfires at the designated locations. In addition, there would be simulated surprise attacks during the night. If I were in those students' shoes, I would be quite worried too. When the students began complaining, the professor warned them that he could hear every single one of them perfectly well. As soon as the training began, everyone quickly sprang into action and hurried to carry out their assigned tasks. That night, Gray Lee began organizing who would be responsible for each watch shift. The girl wanted to sleep as much as possible, just like everyone else. Since two-person shifts would interfere with their rest, Gray Lee decided to have only one person stand watch at a time. The first and last shifts were the easiest. Whoever took the middle shifts would have their sleep interrupted several times. Gray Lee chose the second shift, leaving only the task of finding someone willing to take the third. The boy Gray Lee had saved from the bear attack volunteered for the third shift. Thus, Rumia, Gray Lee, Bask, and Benes divided the watch among themselves. After finishing their shift, each person had to wake the next before going to sleep. However, as expected, a simulated attack began in the middle of the night. Gray Lee heard approaching footsteps. A monster would probably make far more noise, so it certainly did not sound like an ordinary creature. Rumia apparently noticed no sound at all, making Gray Lee wonder for a moment whether he had imagined everything. But it was not his imagination. He could clearly sense someone nearby, trying to advance unnoticed at that hour. Given the timing, there was a good chance it was one of the professors carrying out the simulated attack. Even so, Gray Lee could not relax because he knew he had become a target of those involved in the previous incidents. Prepared for the worst, he considered the possibility that it was an assassin and silently advanced through the forest beneath the full moon. While examining the tracks and surveying the surroundings, Gray Lee suddenly remembered an old training exercise involving the bow. It was a divine bow technique that Jacob had once taught Gray Lee and the other members of the platoon. Normally, people placed their heel down first, creating more noise. To walk silently, it was better to land on the toes first and let the heel touch the ground last. Even when stepping on branches or leaves, the key was to avoid the regular rhythm of human footsteps. Irregular sounds could easily blend with the natural noises of animals or the wind. During that training, the platoon had to begin by learning how to walk barefoot through the mountains. Drawing on all that experience, Gray Lee managed to move through the forest while making almost no sound. Without being noticed, he approached and placed his sword against a professor's neck. Gray Lee then asked whether this was some kind of surprise attack conducted as part of the training. The professor confirmed it and explained that he was merely checking whether they were keeping the area properly guarded. He simply had not expected to be caught by surprise with a sword so close to his neck. At that point, it was difficult to tell who was teaching whom. Gray Lee still considered the possibility that the man was pretending to be a professor to make him lower his guard. However, if he truly had malicious intentions, he would probably be carrying a proper weapon. It was at that exact moment that Rumia appeared, and found Gray Lee standing before the professor. The professor explained that he had come to inspect the group's watch and said that their performance had been flawless. In fact, he admitted that he had never seen freshmen organize a campsite and watch duty so efficiently. Rumia, however, found the situation strange and asked whether Gray Lee was not supposed to be sleeping at that hour. Gray Lee asked the professor whether he had stepped on a branch while approaching. After receiving an affirmative answer, he confirmed that the sound really had come from a person. Surprised, the professor asked whether Gray Lee had detected the attack because of that faint sound while sleeping. Gray Lee replied that it had actually been mere coincidence, since he had not yet fallen into a deep sleep at the time. Upon hearing that explanation, the professor could not hold back a hearty laugh. He remarked that first there had been the simulated battle the previous day, and now this. Gray Lee simply kept surprising everyone. The professor no longer even knew whether there was anything left he could teach that boy. Because of that, he made a decision from that point onward. Gray Lee was forbidden from participating in nighttime watch training. If he handled everything alone, the other students in his group would never have a chance to learn. Furthermore, the group would not face any surprise attacks between 1 and 3 in the morning, since the professors would assume Gray Lee was standing watch during that period. Even so, he would receive full marks for his performance during the nighttime training. The professor also congratulated Gray Lee on the result. The professor remained impressed as he thought about how the boy had appeared behind him without his noticing his presence. It seemed impossible for someone his age. There was no questioning Gray Lee's level of skill. To the professor, that boy simply defied all logic. The next morning, the group resumed their journey and managed to advance without encountering any major problems. At least that was true for some of them. The members of the other groups were completely exhausted, since practically none of them had managed to sleep properly. Gray Lee's group was in slightly better condition, although they were also far from feeling fully rested. Some students were so sleepy that they even stumbled and fell while making their way along the path. When the day finally came to an end, everyone was still quite exhausted from the long journey. One of the professors warned that night was almost upon them and announced that they would set up camp there. The students eagerly asked whether they could finally rest, but another professor replied that they would still have to endure that exhausting camping routine once again. To their surprise, the professor announced that the day's training was over. The tents were already prepared, and everyone could rest while waiting for the food. Naturally, no one wasted the opportunity, and everyone made the most of their long-awaited rest. Gray Lee grew suspicious of how peaceful everything was. If the professors were allowing them to rest so well, it probably meant that the next day would be extremely difficult. He was talking with Leonhardt, who assured him that Gray Lee would certainly overcome the next challenge without difficulty. The boy clearly admired him greatly. Later, the half-coach appeared wearing an apron and revealed what he had prepared for the students. Before them was an enormous amount of food, practically a true feast. Everyone ate with smiles on their faces, and some were even moved by how happy the meal made them. However, all that generosity concealed a trick. In truth, it was part of yet another elaborate plan prepared by the professors. The following morning, the students would undergo training that required them to cross a dangerous region of the mountain range. After resting well, the students seemed refreshed and continued their journey with far more energy. Up to that point, to the surprise of some, not a single student had dropped out of the training. The professor explained that this was the bare minimum expected of anyone who had passed the academy entrance exam. However, the real training would begin just 2 kilometers ahead. Once they crossed that point, they would enter the territory of the water lizards, creatures far more powerful than the monsters they had previously hunted for food. Without preparation, most of them would barely have a chance to react against those creatures. Therefore, their objective was to cross the entire region without being detected. It is a 2-week rotational training exercise held in a dangerous zone. Fortunately, water lizards tend to move very little during the dry season to conserve energy. As long as no one makes too much noise, the creatures probably will not notice their presence. However, during this rainless season, they become desperate for any source of liquid. That even includes blood, so under no circumstances could they attract the attention of those creatures. Gray Lee once again remembered the training he had received from the Divine Archer Lord. Then the teacher responsible for the ambush the other night approached Gray Lee. He remarked that Gray Lee must already have experience hunting monsters. Even if this seemed easy to him, he should not lower his guard. Meanwhile, the other students were moving far too slowly. Because of that, the group of teachers began urging them to pick up the pace. The students were quite apprehensive about continuing forward. Gray Lee wondered why they had not received instructions beforehand. At the very least, they should have practiced this in a safe environment before being taken into the field. The teacher explained, however, that making noise was still permitted at that point. The situation changed when they entered a deeper part of the forest where the vegetation was dense and almost no light penetrated. The teacher warned that from that point onward, no one was allowed to speak. All communication would have to be done through signals. Thus, everyone continued forward in a single line, remaining as calm as possible. As they walked, everyone imagined that monsters truly were hiding everywhere around them. At one point, a boy lost focus, slipped on a rock, and fell, making an extremely loud noise. As expected, the sound immediately drew the attention of the nearby creatures. They were the dreaded water lizards. The creatures resembled beastmen with reptilian features. Hathcote had to intervene and take down one of the creatures before it could reach the student in danger. Neilhart also tried to confront one of the approaching monsters. However, his attack did not even leave a mark on the lizard's tough chest. The teacher explained that those creatures were beyond the students' abilities and ordered everyone to retreat. The teachers were able to handle the situation, although the battle still seemed far from easy. The students were impressed when they saw the teachers finally neutralize those creatures so quickly. One of them explained that water lizards usually have very little internal moisture near the end of the dry season. If they lose even more bodily fluid, they become much easier to defeat. During the rainy season, however, encountering them would be extremely dangerous. That was why this marching exercise only took place after they confirmed that no rain was forecast. The teacher added that they were only allowed to talk at that moment because the surrounding water lizards had already been eliminated. Afterward, the group resumed their march and finally left that denser part of the forest behind. Along the way, they encountered and defeated several more lizards. Athcote then announced that the ascent was over and congratulated all the students. Up to that point, no one had given up. Leonhardt seemed more mentally exhausted than physically tired. After all, marching for so long without being able to make practically any sound was already an enormous challenge. Hathcote replied that this was precisely the purpose of the training. Altogether, the lizards had detected them 4 times. Even so, according to him, this year's exercise had been peaceful compared with previous years. Afterward, he allowed the students to ask questions. Graylee mentioned something that concerned him. A cloud was rapidly growing and being driven by the wind toward the group. Rain was practically impossible at that time of year, yet the formation was becoming darker and denser. Hathcote immediately decided to cancel the training. They needed to leave that territory as quickly as possible. Some teachers disagreed, saying they should not interrupt the entire exercise merely because of a cloud. Hathcote countered that a formation like that was abnormal for the season. To him, the students' safety came before any training. A female teacher pointed out that Vorman had been leading that expedition for years and that his judgment was reliable. He suggested simply accelerating their march and using the situation as training, ordering everyone to advance as though their lives depended on it. No one could fall behind, and regardless of what happened, they had to avoid making any loud noises. The group continued forward, but shortly afterward, heavy rain began to fall. Hathcote immediately realized that it did not seem natural. Perhaps the rain had been artificially produced on purpose. Vormund also observed that the rain had indeed begun. Graylee whispered that speaking at that volume was not safe under those circumstances. Vormund had deliberately raised his voice, and a water lizard soon appeared behind him. He managed to dodge and retaliated with a strike that wounded the creature. Even so, the lizard remained standing, as its body was now completely hydrated. The creature's tail knocked Vormund's sword away and then sent him flying. Graylee knew that a teacher's reflexes should have been much better. Even so, Vormund ended up seriously injured. The students then realized that those lizards were much stronger than before. They knew the creatures could move like that, but now their speed was on an entirely different level. Hathcote remained focused and advanced alongside the other teachers. They had enough strength and speed to injure the monsters, but the situation remained difficult. Even working together, the teachers had great difficulty bringing those creatures down. Hathcote was the only one who managed to completely defeat the first lizard during the confrontation. After finally bringing it down with great difficulty, Vormund admitted that not even the teachers would escape unscathed. He canceled the training and ordered them to use emergency teleportation, asking whether everything was ready. A female teacher replied that it was not. She had been trying to cast the teleportation spell for some time, but the spell simply would not activate. Another teacher stated that he could also use that magic, but was facing the same problem. It became clear that someone was deliberately blocking teleportation. Hathcote concluded that it was not only the teleportation. The rain also seemed deliberately induced, indicating that someone had chosen the expedition as a target. Vormund deliberately shouted again, making sure to draw attention. The other professor said that advancing through the lizard territory under Chilva would be practically suicidal. Their only option seemed to be setting up camp and waiting for Chilva to finally stop. The half-coach remarked that there was a good chance the rain was artificial as well. If so, it would not stop. The professor, however, believed their chances of survival would be greater if they stayed there rather than repeatedly facing those creatures. Wormel was still receiving treatment for the injuries he had suffered in the previous battle. The half-coach acknowledged that it would be difficult, but no one could guarantee that the place would not come under attack again. They needed to find another option. Ray Lee then spoke up. Since they still had healing magic, he could fight as well, and perhaps they could force their way through. Hathcote said that, with that power, Gray Lee could probably make it through the territory. The problem was whether his body could withstand the strain. Ray Lee replied that no help would come if they simply remained there. To him, taking that risk was better than merely waiting for the worst. The half-coach warned that, even with healing magic, Gray Lee would have to use that power several times in a single day, something Ariel had forbidden. Even so, Gray Lee saw it as a chance to train and trusted the Academy's healers. Hathcote reminded him again that healing magic could not repair every kind of damage. Gray Lee asked whether there was any other way to get all the students back safely. He then asked whether they intended to let everyone die there merely to protect him. The half-coach then remembered a conversation he had once had with Ariel. She had explained that Gray Lee would not hesitate to sacrifice himself if necessary. It was precisely that determination that made him so strong. Because of that, Ariel had asked the half-coach to prevent Gray Lee from doing anything irreversible. Even so, he looked at the group of students and finally made a decision. Alright, although it was difficult to admit, he agreed to let Gray Lee lend them his strength. Vormal complained that they were making decisions on their own. Gray Lee might have distinguished himself in the competition, but placing everyone's lives in the hands of a single student seemed absurd. The professor countered that, with Gray Lee's power, he could face a water lizard alone. It was precisely because of that ability that placing their faith in his strength was worthwhile. Vormal, however, continued to object and called for Professor Galag. He ordered him to use communication magic to send a rescue request to the academy, saying that would be a much safer alternative. Galag replied that he had already sent the request. The communication magic was suffering from interference, but the message had probably already reached the academy. Varmo asked whether Halfcoat finally understood. Acting on their own would only increase the risks, and no one wanted to put the students in danger. Halfcoat urged him to lower his voice so he would not attract more creatures. In the end, they decided to remain there. The rain continued without respite. Vormal seemed satisfied with the decision, while new noises from the forest announced the approach of more creatures. Gray Lee said that they were ready to act at any moment. Halfcoat replied that, if anything got out of control, he would intervene personally. Shortly afterward, a powerful lizard emerged and charged toward the group. The professors managed to restrain it, although one of them was injured during the confrontation. Fortunately, it was nothing serious. The problem was that two others noticed the fight and also began approaching. Gray Lee drew his sword, and some of the braver students did the same. The half-coach told everyone to watch carefully, as they were about to see how the academy's professors truly fought. The group of professors displayed such overwhelming strength that the students never even needed to use their swords. Some professors suffered minor injuries, but nothing that seriously affected the battle. Leonhardt became convinced that they could overcome the situation. The strangest thing happened when some of the professors suddenly attacked their own group. Their targets were the half-coach and another professor who remained focused on protecting the students. Gray Lee reacted immediately and disarmed them before they could complete their attack. Some of the professors revealed that they had already suspected what was happening. Halfcoat thanked Gray Lee for his quick intervention and said they would deal with the lizards while the matter was resolved. Once the situation was under control, they approached Vormel and the other man involved, demanding an explanation. They wanted to know exactly what the two men had been trying to do. Varmo claimed that he had merely been fighting the lizard and that the insolent student had attacked his arm. The other man tried to give the same excuse. The professor on watch called the excuse ridiculous. Almost everyone had already noticed their attempt, and the swordsmanship students were experienced enough to confirm what they had seen. The half-coach remarked that, unfortunately, assassination or kidnapping attempts against academy members were not exactly uncommon. The academy had many enemies and gathered numerous important people. Someone had tried to exploit the fight against the water lizard to eliminate a professor. Others were also involved, including those who had sabotaged communication and teleportation. They were all still alive only because Gray Lee noticed the danger and reacted in time. Gray Lee then revealed to the half-coach that he had suspected from the beginning that those men were trying to attack them. Vormel, surprised, declared that there was no way their plan could have been leaked. Realizing what he had just said, he immediately fell silent. Gray Lee replied that, in fact, he had known absolutely nothing about the plan before that. He simply explained that observing Vormel's eyes and body language was enough to realize that something was wrong. The way they moved did not resemble people trying to protect the students. To some extent, Gray Lee had simply thought they were incompetent. However, after the rain began, it became obvious that certain actions were deliberate. They shouted unnecessarily and deliberately placed themselves in the path of the creature's attacks. Since Gray Lee had used his power only briefly, his body was still relatively fine. It merely felt like severe muscle pain. Vormel then began laughing and said they still had not realized that it was already too late. Everyone was trapped in the heart of the lizard's habitat under torrential rain. A powerful teleportation seal had blocked their escape routes, and reinforcements would not arrive in time. Even though the plan had been exposed, according to him, there was no longer any way to escape. Everyone could end up dying there, although that had never been the objective. If they went with them, they would surely understand. That was why they had prepared a way out, even for Professor Ranch, allowing them to end their own lives. Right there, at that very moment. They could not take anyone capable of interfering with the plan. Besides, they were using the students as threats and hostages, but the professor who tried to attack the students was immediately subdued by Gray Lee, who appeared behind him in an instant. He asked whether the man had used teleportation to infiltrate the group. With teleportation interference and communications blocked, slipping by unnoticed would not have been difficult for him. After all, he was the magic professor who had remained beside Vormo the entire time. Half-Coach remarked that Gray Lee was far too intelligent to seem like an ordinary student. Half-Coat also pressured the magic professor, demanding that he activate teleportation immediately. He was to send everyone back to the mountain base. If he continued refusing, he would face severe consequences, and the threat would keep escalating until he finally obeyed. Gray Lee warned him not to try sending them somewhere else or leaving anyone behind. Any suspicious movement would be treated as an immediate threat. Wormo, however, ordered Professor Galak not to activate the teleportation magic. Even so, Galak continued refusing to obey, so Half-Coach lunged at him, but Galak managed to dodge at the last instant. In the end, he gave in and activated the teleportation, sending everyone back to the academy. The night shift staff quickly realized that this was the first-year swordsmanship expedition squad. Half-Coach explained that, during training in the lizard habitat, they had encountered an extremely dangerous anomaly and had been forced to carry out an emergency evacuation. The cause had been an assassination attempt planned by members of the faculty, including 2 magic professors accompanying the expedition. The swordsmanship students confirmed the entire account. Leonhardt stated that the entire squad could have been wiped out. Gray Lee and Professor Hathcote, however, noticed the plan in time and managed to save everyone. Fortunately, none of the students had suffered serious injuries requiring immediate treatment, except for Vormal, of course. Even so, no one seemed particularly interested in helping him. All the students and professors involved in the incident underwent questioning. Later, during the trial held at the academy, the director announced who had planned the entire incident. Professor Vormo, the expedition supervisor, was identified as the leader, while Professor Balin, the deputy supervisor, was named as his main accomplice. The two had also received support from magic professors originally assigned to emergency situations. Galak and Hent actively participated in the criminal plan throughout the incident. According to the ruling, there were no circumstances that could lessen their responsibility. Therefore, under the Academy's laws, they received the maximum punishment available. In addition, to investigate possible accomplices and other connections, the interrogators were authorized to use extreme methods. Therefore, their fate would remain quite severe even before the final sentence. The director made it absolutely clear that none of those responsible would be spared. Vormo even tried to escape at that moment. However, one of the guards immediately restrained him before he could get away. The director ordered everyone to be taken away and declared that Professor Galak was nearly as responsible as the others. At the last moment, however, Galak abandoned the plan and helped the students escape. That reduced his sentence. After interrogation, he could remain alive among the condemned since he had assisted in the rescue and reduced the damage. Even so, remaining alive did not always mean receiving the best possible fate. After all that chaos, Half-Coach was visibly stressed and remarked that Gray Lee had already faced something similar shortly after entering the academy. Since the beginning of the year, he already seemed accustomed to getting dragged into this kind of trouble. Sonic had never imagined that so many criminals could hide among the professors. Hathcote remarked that it was hard to believe this place was supposed to be the greatest educational institution in the world. Gray Lee admitted that reality was nothing like the image he had held of the academy before arriving there. The professor replied that some people did not even consider the World Union Academy a true educational institution. To many, it functioned more like a selection facility, since the students entered already possessing exceptional strength. The graduates were outstanding because they already started at a high level. Besides, some people said that the professors themselves did not have all that much influence. Gray Lee replied that, frankly, he sometimes wondered about that as well. However, there was one thing he knew with absolute certainty. Since arriving at the academy, he had become much stronger. Perhaps it truly was not wise to place complete trust in the institution as an organization. Even so, there were trustworthy professors, such as Hathcote and Ariel. For Gray Lee, that was enough. Half-Coach remarked that he truly did not speak like an ordinary student. In any case, the academy's training only started becoming truly intense after a certain point. Gray Lee would become far more powerful from then on. After all, that had always been his goal. Sometime later, one of the swordsmanship professors began reorganizing matters after the problems that had occurred during the marching exercise. At least that stage had officially ended, completing the basic physical training. From that moment onward, the students would move on to the next phase. Before that, however, the professor decided to demonstrate the goal they needed to reach. Then he raised his sword and with a single motion, cut through a steel stake 145 millimeters in diameter. The students would also need to cut through that same piece cleanly using only a single strike. Only then would they be qualified to advance. Anyone unable to complete the task by the end of the semester would be expelled. Every year, approximately half the students failed this test. In practice, very few students actually managed to graduate from the World Union Academy. Even so, there was no need to despair. What happened after expulsion depended greatly on the year in which a student left the academy. Those who left during the first year were normally transferred to an ordinary academy in their own country and advanced rapidly through the grades, since they were still considered elite students compared with everyone else. If they preferred to work, many ended up joining the Royal Guard as elite swordsmen. From the moment they entered the World Union Academy, the public had already stopped regarding them as ordinary people. They only seemed inferior when compared with the extraordinary talents of that academy. Compared with the rest of the world, however, they were still among the best. Gray Lee realized that this was exactly as Master Sarya had explained. The difference between that academy and anywhere else truly was absurd. The swordsmanship professor stated that, instead of worrying about what would happen if they were expelled, they would be better off focusing all their attention on cutting through that stake. After all, they could simply start by trying. One of the students attempted the cut, but the impact tore the sword from his hand, causing intense pain. The teacher said he had already expected him to fail to cut it, but letting go of the sword was unacceptable. A swordsman should never lose control of his own blade. Gray Lee asked whether there were any restrictions on which sword they could use. He thought that with the weapon he had received from Ariel, he could probably cut through it in a single stroke. The teacher confirmed that there were limitations and that only standard swords were permitted. Even so, he believed Gray Lee could probably pass the test at that moment. If he relied on his own power, Gray Lee would certainly pass immediately. However, since this was a requirement for advancing to the next year, he needed to learn how to do it without depending on that ability. For that reason, he decided that he had to master the technique without using that power. If he could later combine the two, the results might be even greater. With his ability and enormous potential for growth, perhaps Gray Lee could reach a level comparable to the Liquidator. To reach that point, however, he still had to endure and overcome that pain. After the demonstration, the teacher said that everyone was probably wondering whether it was truly possible to cut through that using only a sword. Perhaps they were also wondering whether absurd strength like Gray Lee's was necessary to make it into the second year. However, that was not the case. The teacher asked whether they had ever considered why second-year students and teachers were so far superior to freshmen. The answer lay in life force infusion, the ability to channel the energy naturally present in every human being into a sword. Gray Lee had not yet mastered that technique, but he had already heard of it in his previous life. Life force, also called OD, was used in the refinement of ultra-compressed ether. The World Union Academy had apparently developed a way to apply it directly to swordsmanship. Gray Lee grew excited at the prospect of learning it. Fortunately, they would not need to master complicated theories because the teacher explained that once they understood the sensation, they would be able to infuse life force into an ordinary sword. However, the sword before them was a demonic weapon capable of draining life force. No one showed any desire or courage to touch it. Leonhardt ended up being the first to raise his hand. He knew that merely being the top student was not enough, because at this rate he would remain far behind Gray Lee. The teacher believed Gray Lee would be able to withstand it without much difficulty. However, his performance would not serve as a good reference for the other students. For that reason, Leonhardt was chosen first. He drew the sword and immediately felt the strange, threatening aura emanating from it. The teacher warned that no one should hold it for too long. They had to draw, attack immediately, and sheath it again. Leonhardt followed the instructions, and his strike cut almost halfway through the metal stake. Immediately after completing the attack, however, Leonhardt completely lost his strength and collapsed to the ground. Even in his severely weakened state, he still managed to muster enough strength to sheath the sword again. Professor Ranch explained that this was normal during the first attempts. Even so, he emphasized that Leonhardt had not even dropped the weapon. It was exactly what one would expect from the top student. After that demonstration, the teacher decided that Gray Lee could also make an attempt. The moment he drew the sword, Gray Lee clearly felt his energy being drained. He immediately understood that he would not be able to hold it for long. Even so, his first strike almost cut completely through the metal stake. Only a small section remained before it would have been severed entirely. After the attack, he sheathed the sword, took a deep breath, and to everyone's surprise, still managed to remain standing. Hent remarked that he had never seen a freshman withstand that sword without dropping to his knees. Gray Lee clearly possessed far greater endurance than he had imagined. Much of that endurance came from the harsh training Gray Lee had previously undergone with Ref. He was already accustomed to pushing his own body to its limits during training. Still dissatisfied, Gray Lee decided to try a second time and attacked again the moment he drew the sword. This time, he immediately realized that he had gone too far. His consciousness began to fade, but he still tried at least to sheath the sword. In the end, he collapsed to the ground like Leonhardt, but managed to sheath the weapon before completely losing his strength. While the two remained unconscious, Hank decided that the class could continue as usual. Then the other students prepared to continue with the exercise. Hank showed them the stakes struck by Leonhardt and Gray Lee, explaining that swordsmanship based on life force possessed extraordinary power. The technique could damage a steel stake to that extent. Despite such effectiveness, the World Union Academy was practically the only institution equipped to teach it properly. A female student asked whether other academies avoided the technique because it was dangerous. Hank explained that no one had died from using that sword because it stopped draining energy once the user became sufficiently weakened. Leonhardt, who had already regained consciousness, remarked that the real reason was probably the rarity of that sword. Red replied that it was indeed rare, but that was not the main reason. The Academy possessed around 30 of them, with others scattered throughout the world. In the past, those swords had been used in real combat, but they caused countless losses over time. For that reason, they eventually stopped being used that way. Gray Lee observed that even if the sword did not kill its user, becoming unable to move on the battlefield would allow the enemy to finish the job. Therefore, to use that power in a real battle, it was essential to keep moving after activating it. The teacher stated that almost no one outside the academy could do that. Hank considered that answer perfect. After all, being able to activate the technique only once during a fight would be practically useless. Someone could only be said to have mastered that power when they could wield a life force sword as naturally naturally as any other weapon. Otherwise, the swordsman would not be controlling that power. In practice, the technique itself would be controlling the user. The students then asked whether every second-year student could already use that ability. The teacher replied that all of them had to learn to use life force as naturally as breathing. They could also practice with those swords outside class. They simply had to avoid overdoing it, fainting, and arriving late for their other training sessions. Still lying on the ground, Gray Lee understood that he needed to find a way to use that power normally. If he lost consciousness after a single activation, its usefulness would be minimal. The exact same problem also applied to his own special ability. Whenever he relied on that shadow power, Gray Lee ended up losing consciousness shortly afterward. Sometimes he even needed help from a healer to recover. Therefore, he needed to learn how to use at least one of those two abilities safely. Coming to the World Union Academy had been an excellent choice. Gray Lee realized that he would be hard-pressed to find another place so well-suited to helping him continue growing stronger. If he could one day combine that technique with his own power, his strength might reach a terrifying level. Sometime later, at the end of another day of training, Gray Lee was once again at the second practice field. He continued striking the same stake repeatedly, coming closer and closer to cutting completely through it with a single blow. Gray Lee rested for about 3 minutes between each strike. In this way, his life force recovered at almost the same rate that it was consumed. It was a rather inefficient way to train, but little by little, he was beginning to understand better how to control that energy. Then came the time to test an ordinary sword. Gray Lee tried drawing it while the sensation of life force within his body was still fresh in his memory. However, one of the staff members mentioned Professor Ariel Winston. He explained that Ariel had asked to be present when Gray Lee attempted to use the Vital Force sword on his own and asked whether he should call her. Gray Lee asked whether she was not too busy with all that paperwork. The staff member replied that the professor had already expected he would understand the technique that day, so she had cleared her schedule in advance. Gray Lee thought that woman was truly frightening, as expected of someone with the divine eye. Ariel appeared shortly afterward, apologized for the delay, and told them to resume the training. However, she was accompanied by another hooded person. Before starting, Gray Lee asked whether he could practice once with the magical life drain sword. Ariel allowed it and explained that she would only observe. He delivered a strike that nearly cut completely through the stake. Gray Lee thought he needed to memorize that sensation so he could reproduce it later with an ordinary sword. He then focused, took a deep breath, and tried to gather his power at the correct point. However, the moment he did so, his entire arm was overtaken by a dark force. It was a power coming from within him, and it felt nothing like vital force. Those sealed doors seemed to demand more. The more power emerged, the less Gray Lee was able to maintain control. Ariel immediately ordered the staff members to handle the situation. Then Professor Dias Grima removed the affected arm. Gray Lee's limbs soon dissolved into shadows. Ariel remarked that special powers truly had terrible compatibility with vital force. At that moment, the hooded figure revealed herself to be Rafa Elixir, a professor specializing in healing magic. Using her ability, Rafa easily restored Gray Lee's arm. Bones, muscles, fibers, and tissues were completely reconstructed. Ariel remarked that no matter how many times she witnessed it, Rafa's forced regeneration remained impressive. Rafa said she was pleased to have switched to that branch of magic. She acknowledged that it was all thanks to Ariel, who had discovered her talent. She then said that Gray Lee would wake in a few hours and asked them to call her if anything happened. When he woke up, Gray Lee found Ariel beside him, cutting an apple for him. He explained that the moment he tried to activate the Vital Force sword, the power in his arm went completely out of control. All the vital force had been drained away. After that, the teaching assistant had to remove his arm. Even while remembering it, Gray Lee was surprised to see that his arm was intact again. Ariel said that his memory seemed to be preserved. Unfortunately, exactly what she had feared had happened. Gray Lee then asked whether she had already known that this could happen. Ariel replied that she had not been certain, but she had witnessed something similar before. It happened when Amy White tried to use vital force. That was precisely why Ariel had decided to personally accompany Gray Lee. He was genuinely surprised. He had never imagined that the same thing had happened to the Sword Saint. Ariel explained that Amy's arm had been unable to withstand the mixture of her ability and vital force, causing an extremely violent reaction. Gray Lee reacted in shock and asked how that had happened. Ariel explained that at least they had not needed to remove her arm. However, the shock had been so severe that Amy still avoided using vital force even now. Gray Lee then asked whether, despite that, she had managed to learn the technique. Ariel confirmed that she had. Amy succeeded, although the process had been extremely difficult. To help her, Ariel used a special type of contract magic capable of temporarily suppressing Amy White's power. During the training, that restraint was gradually reduced until Amy finally managed to manifest only vital force. Gray Lee had not known that contract magic could be used that way. Unfortunately, Ariel explained that this method would not work for him. Contract magic was not suitable for suppressing the kind of power Gray Lee possessed. Even against Amy White's power, the contract had lasted less than 3 minutes. Against Gray Lee's power, it probably would not endure even half a second. Gray Lee asked whether there was no way to adapt the same method in that case. Ariel apologized and admitted that she had not found a solution. His power was far too unknown, with no precedents or formulas that could serve as references. Even so, that did not mean he could never use vital force. With enough training, he would probably be able to master it, although the process would be extremely difficult. The problem was that whenever he tried to use vital force without control, his power could go completely out of control, and without an arm, continuing to practice would be impossible. Gray Lee asked whether they could simply remove his arm every time that happened and then restore it with recovery magic. That way, he could continue training. Ariel was completely stunned by his proposal. She said she could arrange it, but asked whether he truly wanted to follow that path. After all, there was also the option of simply giving up on vital force. Gray Lee's natural power was already far superior to that of the vital force sword. Using only that, he would probably pass the advancement exam without difficulty. Gray Lee replied that his goal was not merely to reach the second year. He wanted to continue becoming stronger and stronger. Ariel had already expected he would answer that way. She then promised to arrange for someone who specialized in recovery magic. Before that, Gray Lee wanted to practice extensively with the magical life drain sword to improve his sense of extracting vital force. Afterward, he would need healing and someone to sever his arm whenever he lost control. Ariel agreed to arrange everything and said she would support him, even though she knew the training would be extremely painful and difficult. One morning, the swordsmanship students were practicing their strikes against several stakes. After only 30 minutes of practice, many of them were already beginning to finish their training. Gray Lee, however, had been training for much longer and still intended to continue. That day, he had not fainted even once while using the sword capable of draining vital force. The others could hardly believe it. To them, it seemed impossible that Gray Lee had been swinging that sword since early morning. For example, after only 30 minutes, their bodies were already completely exhausted and aching. Even so, at that moment, Gray Lee swung his sword again. Soon afterward, he lost consciousness, but managed to get back up again only a few seconds later. He believed he would eventually understand it if he kept swinging the sword without stopping, but began to realize that he still had not grasped the correct method. Without understanding the true essence of the technique, all that effort would amount to nothing more than wasted training. However, the moment Gray Lee remembered the liquidator, he immediately regained his motivation. He took a deep breath, focused all his attention, and then moved forward. With a single sword strike, he managed to split the stake in half. He had finally succeeded. Now he intended to repeat it using an ordinary sword. However, when he paid closer attention, he realized that he had already been using a normal sword when he performed the strike. Gray Lee concluded that it had probably just been luck. So he continued striking the metal stake repeatedly with that ordinary sword. Even so, his training was still far from over. He needed to practice many more strikes using life energy. Gray Lee was clearly pleased with the result. Meanwhile, the other students began asking whether that strike had really turned out as expected. In truth, the cut looked slightly different from the one performed by the professor, but Gray Lee did not even notice. Later, he ate as though he had been starving for days. He had already emptied a stack of plates and was still hungry. Romeo remarked that she was impressed by how much food he could eat. Leonhardt said that was typical of Gray Lee. After all, he had already completely mastered the use of life energy. Since that technique consumes so much energy, eating that much was practically the bare minimum needed to restore the body's strength. Homia asked whether using a lot of magic sword techniques would also let her eat without gaining weight. To her, that would be quite the motivation. At that moment, a message from Professor Ariel echoed through the loudspeakers. Gray Lee needed to report to her office. Since Ariel rarely summoned him publicly like that, he immediately suspected that something important had happened. As soon as he arrived, Ariel showed him a document containing an urgent message. Gray Lee had been chosen for the prestigious special selection training of the Star Readers. The message said that he should prepare himself mentally and be ready to fight at any moment. Professor Anonymous, known as the Star Reader, said that he prayed for Gray Lee's survival and growth. Gray Lee asked what that meant. Being ready to fight at any moment sounded like actual combat. Ariel replied that it was only called training in name. They sent the best students into extremely dangerous situations without any support, forcing them to fight alone. Ariel considered it an event in terrible taste. There had even been cases where participants were sent into criminal organization hideouts, surrounded by enemies with no possibility of retreat through teleportation. They were only extracted after every enemy had been defeated. Many students never returned from the experience, and fewer than half of the participants managed to survive. There were even years when not a single participant returned. Because of that, the training had a terrible reputation even among the upper ranks. Ariel explained that, in Gray Lee's case, the selection had probably been made deliberately, since he had been targeted by someone. Gray Lee remarked that it definitely did not sound like something that could be called training. Ariel also refused to treat it that way. For that reason, she had a proposal for him. They could simply refuse the summons, although normally a selected student did not have that right. However, because he belonged to the Divine Eye special quota, Gray Lee could refuse by using Ariel's authority. Gray Lee knew that the training was extremely dangerous. Even so, if it had continued to exist for so many years, perhaps it truly produced results. He asked Ariel whether it could make make him stronger. She immediately replied that it was not even worth trying. Even so, Gray Lee asked whether she truly believed he would not survive. If Ariel said he would die, then he would give up. Ariel honestly replied that she believed he would survive. In truth, she did not even need to analyze it very deeply to reach that conclusion. A first-year student with a level of power comparable to Gray Lee's had almost never appeared in history. In truth, there had been a few, but they ended up meeting unfortunate fates. Ariel then began telling him about something that had happened around 400 years ago. At that time, 2 students from the Divine Eye special quota were selected for the same training. They were in the same course as Gray Lee and were exceptionally talented for mere freshmen. Gray Lee immediately thought of something else. Just how old was that woman really? Back then, Ariel believed the two would be fine and allowed them to participate in the training without much concern. However, the outcome was terrible. One of them never returned, and they were not even able to recover his body. The other survived, but lost an arm, and the healing magic of that era was unable to restore it. Gray Lee knew very well that losing an arm normally meant the end of any swordsman's career. During the entrance exam, one of his arms had also stopped responding, and that alone had been extremely difficult. Gray Lee could not even imagine what it would be like to truly lose it. Ariel explained that normally, it would have been the end. However, that young man was different. She then asked whether Gray Lee knew the name Viduro Duran. Gray Lee remembered immediately. Viduro Duran had been an extremely famous swordsman in the past, and Ariel explained that he had been among the strongest people in the world at the time. Duran had been the very survivor of that training. Ariel sometimes wondered how far he might have gone if he had still possessed both arms. Ariel wanted Gray Lee to understand the true danger of that training. She did not want to see him suffer the same fate, nor allow a talent like his to be wasted. Gray Lee said he understood and did not even intend to participate. However, something still bothered him. According to the stories, Duran had become much more powerful after losing his arm. Gray Lee then asked whether that extraordinary growth might have happened precisely because of the special training. Ariel immediately realized that she had said too much. Mentioning Duran had been a major mistake. She tried to explain that the Star Reader was a professor known for placing countless students in fatal situations over the years. To Ariel, undergoing his training was comparable to subjecting oneself to the dangerous experiments conducted by Dr. Varian. Even in the world before Gray Lee's regression, Bella Albright had reached the position of the most powerful person in the world. Judging only by the results, the procedure had indeed produced someone like Bella. However, that power had obviously come with serious consequences. If he could become countless times stronger, Gray Lee would choose that path without hesitation. After all, dying would make everything meaningless. That was why he was determined to survive and return alive. Suddenly, another letter sent by Central arrived for Ariel. Central represented the highest ranks of the Academy. Ariel did not even know their faces, nor was she certain whether they were human. The message stated that, regarding the special selection training intended for Gray Lee, the possibility of recommending its cancellation had been considered. However, an additional message had been sent. The Star Reader clearly explained that there was one training program where everyone survived, but only reached a certain limit of strength. In contrast, there was another where 8 out of 10 participants never returned, while the remaining 2 became far more powerful than all 10 from the first case. He then asked which of the 2 options would be chosen. The Star Reader would choose the second. Therefore, using his own authority, he elevated the special selection training to the status of a special order issued directly by Central. That meant it could not be refused. The Star Reader wanted to see how far Gray Lee could go for the sake of the students' continued awakening and the future of that world. Ariel had never seen a special order from Central issued specifically because of a first-year student. It was clear that the Star Reader desperately wanted Gray Lee to participate. Ariel explained that, at that point, he could only reject the training by leaving the academy entirely. She was deeply worried. Judging by the accomplishments of its graduates, it was considered the finest educational institution in the world. However, no other institution destroyed as many talents or lost as many of its own students as the World Union. Considering all of Gray Lee's power, he would probably succeed even outside the academy. Ariel knew she could preserve his life that way. Even so, Gray Lee decided to continue. If he could not survive even training like that, he would not survive the dangers of that world either. Ariel had already expected that answer. Since convincing him would be useless, she decided to at least share some important information. The special training organized by the Star Reader was extremely dangerous, but it was also true that those who survived returned much stronger. Many of the great figures of the past had survived that training. Ariel had avoided mentioning it because she knew Gray Lee would accept immediately. She truly wanted him to give up. Now that preventing his participation was impossible, Ariel only asked him to do everything he could to stay alive. Gray Lee replied that this was exactly his plan as well. 4 students were chosen. From the first year, Gray Lee, the special admission student with the Divine Eye, and the standout Leonhard Appius. From the second year, Louis N. Hartman. The final spot from the third year went to Palm. A messenger went to meet the selected students, since the Star Reader did not usually speak to them directly. Therefore, it was her responsibility to relay the mission. The training would consist of a raid on a human trafficking base belonging to the Bloodsuckers. Thanks to previous attacks on supply routes carried out by other units, it had been confirmed that the facility was temporarily without human captives. Therefore, there would be be no immediate risk to civilians. Even so, the enemies in that raid would be very different from the dummies used in training. This was a real criminal organization, and its members would naturally try to eliminate any intruders. The Star Reader wanted every criminal neutralized and the activities of that facility shut down completely. Louis N. Hartman raised a concern. Rather than training, should this not be a mission assigned to professional soldiers? The messenger replied that the army could handle it. However, opportunities to experience real combat were rare and offered experience impossible to gain through ordinary exercises. Besides, there were very few available soldiers who could be sent to that region. Palm asked whether any professor would accompany them to ensure the group's safety. The messenger explained that facing dangerous situations without any guarantees was part of the objective. Therefore, no professor or safety measure would be provided. Even the defensive magic necklace worn by Palm would have to be left behind. She added that, starting from the third year, it was not unusual to find students whose combat ability already surpassed that of some professors. Leonhardt observed that many faculty members were researchers or teaching specialists, not necessarily powerful combatants. With his special ability, Gray Lee could probably surpass several of them. Gray Lee admitted that it made sense, especially when he remembered the incident involving the water lizards. Since no one had any more questions, the messenger informed them that the teleportation would take place in 2 hours. That time was to be used to discuss strategies and complete all necessary preparations. The messenger provided the destination coordinates, located deep within enemy territory. Gray Lee asked whether a criminal hideout should not have some kind of barrier against teleportation. She explained that the location was normally protected against that kind of intrusion. This time, however, they had found a flaw in the system. The barrier had been destroyed remotely and would take more than 10 hours to become operational again. Before then, the group needed to completely destroy the hideout. Palm asked whether that did not mean the enemies were already expecting an attack. The hooded messenger confirmed it. After all, destroying a teleportation barrier was practically the same as announcing an invasion. By then, the enemies were probably already searching the area for intruders. According to her, that was precisely why the situation would serve as excellent training. While examining the documents, Palm suggested a strategy meeting. Even if it increased their chances of survival only slightly, any advantage would matter. Louis N. Hartman replied that, before making any plans, they should first learn more about each other's abilities. They had already faced one another to some extent in competitive matches, but they still knew almost nothing about the abilities of the senior student Palm. Palm said that one only had to look to see that he was the strongest. Louis could not defeat him even with another person equal to himself, while Leonhardt and Gray Lee seemed relatively close in level. According to him, the difference between those two was not that great. Gray Lee found Palm's confidence amusing, considering he was regarded as the worst third-year student because of his grades. Palm asked whether they wanted to test that. Since none of them needed safety equipment, they could attack him as soon as they were ready. Leonhardt was irritated by the provocation and immediately charged forward with a heavy strike. Even with his back turned, Palm easily blocked the sword and remarked that the attack was far too light. In his view, the best student of that year had probably already been like this in the second year. With a simple flick of his wrist, Palm deflected the strike and sent Louis flying to the other side of the room. Louis ended up stopping right beside the messenger, who seemed quite entertained by the entire situation. Palm stated that, even as the weakest third-year student, he would not lose to someone from the second year. At that moment, Gray Lee finally understood just how great the difference was between second-year and third-year students. Palm, however, continued his explanation and added one exception concerning Gray Lee. If Gray Lee used his full power, Palm would probably be defeated immediately. Surprised, Gray Lee asked whether he already knew his true ability. But Pao stated that there was not a single human in that academy who did not know what had ended the freshman's streak of competitive defeats. No one at that academy had forgotten that achievement. The story had also reached the students in the other years. However, since they said the price of his power was enormous, they probably could not rely too heavily on that ability. Gray Lee asked them to simply consider that resource something he could not use. Palm then decided they would follow the rule of using it only in an emergency. If an impossible enemy appeared, it would be dangerous for Gray Lee to become unable to keep fighting afterward. While Luino was still trying to stand, trembling, the others began working out the plan. 30 minutes before the teleportation, the documents were already spread across the table, organized and covered with notes. Pao explained that nearly all the most likely enemy positions had already been identified. There was a greater concentration of enemies in that particular direction moving throughout the area. Luino remarked that the other 3 areas also had a high chance of containing roughly the same number of enemies. Palm said the situation was slightly different once they took each person's fighting style into account. Luino would take the right side, while Leonhardt should remain closer to the two agreed to the arrangement, and because of that, Gray Lee would be sent precisely to the point that appeared to pose the greatest danger. Leonhardt asked why Palm was sending Gray Lee specifically to that area. Pao replied that, considering his fighting style, it was the most suitable terrain, especially if they encountered specially designated criminals. Leonhardt, however, pointed out that those criminals were extremely powerful and that some of them were former students of the academy itself. Even so, Palm intended to send Gray Lee to exactly the place where those people were most likely to appear. Palm admitted that he had failed to hide his intention from Leonhardt. He had understood everything correctly. He believed that specially designated criminals were present in that training area. Even if the three of them fought together, they probably would not stand any chance against someone of that level. The only one capable of facing them on equal footing was Gray Lee. In that situation, all they could do was trust in his strength. In that world, there were humans with almost monstrous strength, capable of facing thousands of regular soldiers alone. When people with that kind of power chose a life of crime, they ended up classified as specially designated criminals. Palm explained that their strength varied considerably, but many were significantly more powerful than the Academy's own teachers. Gray Lee knew that in a head-on fight against that kind of opponent, his chances would be minimal, just as they had been against the water lizards. Hao had also heard that none of the special selection training exercises in the past had been easy. This time would be no different, and completely preserving Gray Lee's power seemed unrealistic. Leonhardt disagreed. If criminals of that level truly existed, splitting the unit would be risky, because numerical superiority was a basic principle against a stronger enemy. Palm then gave an example. If Leonhardt were present during a battle between Gray Lee and a specially designated criminal, he probably would not be able to contribute much. He would only get in the way and might end up being defeated for nothing. In battles where the difference in level was enormous, numerical superiority made almost no difference. Monsters should be faced by other monsters, while ordinary people like them dealt with the remaining criminals. Leonhardt insisted that Gray Lee's power came at an extremely high price. Even if he defeated the enemy, he would probably be left defenseless afterward. Even if they were forced to let Gray Lee face that opponent alone, they could remain nearby and help him as soon as the battle ended. Palm replied that Leonhardt was underestimating the bloodsuckers. There were countless enemies, while they were only 4. If they all stayed together, they would be surrounded easily. That was why they needed to split up and create confusion at different points throughout the enemy base. Luenol pointed out that fighting alone greatly increased the risk of being attacked from behind. He still agreed with splitting up, but considered two-person teams a safer option. Palm made it clear that he was not asking for opinions. They had already seen the enormous difference in their abilities, and that difference was not limited to combat, but also extended to tactical planning. Therefore, whether they liked it or not, they would follow the plan he had prepared. Gray Lee thought the strategy did not seem very good, but perhaps Palm had something in mind. Only 10 minutes remained until the teleportation activated. They still needed to inspect their equipment and confirm the final details. Gray Lee knew there would not be enough time to convince Palm to change his mind. Starting an argument among themselves shortly before the battle would be even worse. For now, Gray Lee had no choice but to accept. Luenol also stopped objecting after Gray Lee agreed. Leonhardt, however, still looked deeply dissatisfied. When night finally fell, shortly before the teleportation, Leonhardt asked whether Gray Lee was alright. Gray Lee replied that there was no other choice and asked whether there was any chemical storage facility in the area assigned to Leonhardt. If there were healing potions there, Leonhardt could bring some back for him. Gray Lee wanted to be able to return to the front line after using his power. Leonhardt confirmed it and promised that he would deliver the medicine no matter what, even if he had to take a major risk to do so. Meanwhile, at the bloodsucker's base, several workers were trying to clean bloodstains from the floor, a task that always required considerable effort. While one of them complained, the other said the goods storage area was far worse. That was why he preferred to keep working in that corridor. The first worker remarked that they could force the prisoners to do the cleaning. Even with shipments halted, there were probably still a few people left there. The other replied that the remaining prisoners had been used as test subjects or magical materials because keeping people in storage also cost money. Besides, keeping the merchandise alive only caused problems, since the prisoners were always looking for an opportunity to escape. The second man said that catching those who tried to escape was precisely the fun part. Normally, they were only allowed to impose limited punishments, but that was not why they had chosen that job. Suddenly, a current of air swept through the corridor. Something felt wrong, and an unexpected sound echoed through the area. Before the worker, who had already drawn his blade, could react, he was instantly brought down by a swift attack. The other man had no time to respond either, and was neutralized by Leonhardt's blade. Leonhardt remarked that the bloodsuckers were truly despicable, exactly as he had heard. Luenol replied that this was actually better. That way, he could fight them without hesitation or any burden on his conscience. Hao said that from those two men's comments, they had now confirmed the presence of civilians inside the base. Even so, if anyone tried to resist, they were to neutralize them immediately. He then announced that it was time to put the plan into action. The operation began, and each member headed toward a different part of the base. Gray Lee advanced straight through a corridor filled with enemies searching for the lone intruder who had infiltrated the hideout. One of the more confident men decided to face the intruder alone, excited by the chance to return to action after so long. However, he was taken down before he could even react properly. Some of the others were shaken by the sight, but not enough to stop their attack. Naturally, they all underestimated Gray Lee because he was completely alone. But he responded immediately, taking down another man on the front line. That was when they recognized the crest on his chest, belonging to the World Union Academy. From that moment on, fear took hold of them. Even the man who seemed to command the leeches was shocked, unsure how he should react. One of the men tried to ambush Gray Lee from behind, but he was neutralized before he could complete the attack. For those criminals, facing a student from the World Union Academy was reason enough to panic. Even so, one of them insisted that Gray Lee was still only one person. Since he had only one sword, they just needed to surround him and finish him off. The group tried exactly that strategy while one of the leech's mages fired magical projectiles at Gray Lee. Gray Lee immediately noticed that the magic was quite different from the ultra-compressed ether he knew. Perhaps that magical theory truly had vanished over time, remaining known only to him and those other two people. Gray Lee moved quickly, closed the distance, and neutralized the mage before he could continue attacking. As he advanced, he thought those enemies were absurdly weak, exactly as expected. Even so, despite the danger, the criminals still wore that disturbing expression of people who seemed to enjoy causing suffering. One of them realized too late that he had underestimated Gray Lee. The boy's speed forced him to hesitate and retreat to avoid the attack. Gray Lee continued advancing with swift and precise movements of his sword. Before long, the last men in that formation were taken down as well. Gray Lee began to find the situation strange. His opponents were far too weak, and such an easy fight simply made no sense. Everyone at the academy had passed an extremely competitive exam. Comparing them to ordinary members of a criminal organization would be a serious mistake. Even the weakest student in his class could probably handle those men. Despite their numerical advantage, Gray Lee might genuinely be able to defeat all of them alone. The real problem remained the criminals with special designations. Gray Lee then appeared behind the last man commanding the fight, and the criminal quickly tried to make him an offer. Gray Lee asked whether there was any way to obtain information about the specially designated criminal hiding in that place. The man said yes and tried to convince him that it could work to his advantage. He said Gray Lee could even become an elite bodyguard for the leeches. He promised to put in a good word for him and claimed it was one of the best positions in the organization. Normally, a bodyguard only needed to act when dangerous intruders appeared. When opponents too strong for ordinary members appeared, all they had to do was eliminate them. In return, the bodyguards received the best treatment available in the hideout. Judging by the strength he had displayed, the criminal assumed Gray Lee was a second-year student. At that level, he could work as an elite bodyguard and receive anything he wanted. According to him, it would be far better than staying at the academy. Gray Lee was already strong enough to abandon his studies and enjoy life among the leeches. Gray Lee calmly replied that he truly wished his current strength were already enough for all of that. The leech said he should not worry about those above him. Even the organization's lesser criminals were already strong enough to intimidate ordinary people. With the power Gray Lee possessed, according to him, he could live comfortably and obtain practically anything he wanted. Gray Lee then asked a simple question, wanting to know what would happen if he refused the offer. The criminal replied that Gray Lee might defeat the men there, but he would be eliminated shortly afterward. That was because the elite bodyguard of that hideout was far superior to Gray Lee and had once been a third-year student at the World Union Academy. According to him, that man had already been considered stronger than some professors back then. He then asked whether Gray Lee preferred a comfortable life or facing that former student. Gray Lee replied that the choice was extremely simple. First, he would take down that supervisor, then he would deal with the bodyguard as well. He then neutralized the criminal without giving him another chance to react. For Gray Lee, there was now no doubt that the wanted criminal was truly hiding in that place. However, something was strange. The man had referred to the criminals in the plural, not just one. That could indicate the presence of more than one target. Gray Lee had obtained important information, but he was still separated from the group. If there were only one truly powerful enemy, they might still be able to handle him. The problem would be suffering an attack while someone was vulnerable after the confrontation. Because of that, it might be better for Gray Lee to regroup with the others. Meanwhile, Palm was in another part of the base interrogating one of the captured criminals. He wanted to discover exactly which elite member was present in that hideout. The man revealed that it was Medu Varian, daughter of Professor Varian. After that, he assured Palm that there were no other elite criminals in that place. Palm observed his expression and concluded that he was probably telling the truth. At that point, he no longer had any useful information. Palm then ended the interrogation and permanently neutralized that criminal. In the end, there seemed to be only one wanted criminal, exactly as Palm had predicted. Splitting up the group had truly been a calculated choice. Palm knew that one of the biggest mistakes in team combat was having to carry someone incapable of fighting. Protecting that ally while advancing would require nearly the strength of two people. If Gray Lee became incapacitated, a large portion of the group's strength would be used to protect him. However, Palm also knew that everything depended on him surviving the main confrontation. If Gray Lee defeated the target and could still keep fighting afterward, it would be an advantage. Even if he became unable to fight after that, at least he would have removed a powerful enemy. The problem was that Palm did not know whether Medu would appear precisely where Gray Lee was. Even so, judging by the base's layout, it was possible to predict where the enemies would concentrate their main strength. At the last moment, Palm heard something and leaped backward, narrowly avoiding an explosion. He then finally saw who had launched the attack. It was Medu Varian, a third-year mage and daughter of Professor Varian. She coldly stated that no one was even supposed to know she was in that hideout. Upon realizing that some criminal had revealed her presence, Medu concluded that she would have to prevent every intruder from leaving that place with the information. Palm said he had already eliminated the person who leaked the information, sparing Medu from having to deal with it personally. He asked what she was doing there, since every route to the important sectors was required to pass through Sector D15. Medu had not imagined that even the internal map had been leaked. Her post was precisely in Sector D15, but for some reason, it seemed someone was anticipating her every move. Because of that, she decided to act unpredictably. At least this time, she managed to outmaneuver Palm. And indeed, he was completely caught off guard. Medu Varian, as far as he remembered, was a modified human created by her own father. Even among the third-year magic students, she was considered extremely powerful. Palm, on the other hand, ranked last among the third-year swordsmen, so the odds were clearly against him. Medu herself remarked that he did not look like much. Soon afterward, she launched a creature made of black flames at the knight. He responded by splitting that magic in half with a vertical strike infused with life force. Medu asked what the difference between that and magic actually was. Palm replied that she would find out if she continued studying at the World Union. Once swordsmanship reached a certain level, the boundary between it and magic practically disappeared. He then charged forward, enveloping both his body and blade in life force. Medu could not ignore that provocation. To her, magic was far superior to a mere sword technique. She then drew a quantity of special flames from a small vial. They were intense, incandescent, and glowed with an unusual force. That magic was called Bella. The flames transformed into countless arms, all surging toward Palm at the same time. Besides creating walls and bursts of fire, those arms also managed to restrain the knight. The attack left the third-year student unable to continue fighting. When everything ended, his body was severely burned and motionless. Medu became irritated that she had wasted such precious materials on someone she considered insignificant. Even so, she realized that she could still make use of his body for another purpose. Meanwhile, Gray Lee managed to clear an entire corridor by himself. However, shortly before that, he had heard a strange battle. The intensity was on another level, as though someone had used an extremely powerful spell. At that moment, another criminal tried to attack him from behind, but the man could not even complete his attack before being neutralized. Gray Lee realized that he had not heard any further sounds from the fight involving the senior Palm. Thinking calmly, the chances that he was still unharmed were practically non-existent. Ignoring the severe side effects of his power, Palm was one of the greatest combat assets available. If Gray Lee had managed to protect him, the battles ahead might have been much easier. It could have been an important loss that, under different circumstances, might have been avoided. Even if he had known in advance, Gray Lee doubted he could have convinced Palm to act differently. Soon afterward, another criminal consumed by the urge to fight appeared before him. However, another man pulled him back, saying there was no way to defeat those opponents because they were true monsters. Gray Lee then realized that the criminals had stopped rushing at him without any plan. Even so, the moment he turned a corner, he walked directly into an ambush. Despite being surrounded, he managed to dodge every magic bullet fired at him. After that, he neutralized the enemies without much difficulty. Gray Lee wanted to reduce their numbers as much as possible before the elite bodyguard appeared. He needed to move faster. The atmosphere around him had already changed completely. Up to that point, however, Gray Lee had managed to defeat every opponent who appeared. Even so, the mere possibility of facing an elite bodyguard was already putting his nerves to the test. It was at that exact moment that Medu appeared behind Gray Lee. As soon as he sensed her presence, he quickly moved into a well-lit area. Gray Lee immediately noticed that the woman had a peculiar way of speaking and an equally strange presence. There was little doubt. She was certainly the elite bodyguard. Even so, something seemed wrong. Her presence felt artificial, almost as though she were not truly human. Medu remarked that Gray Lee would fall sooner or later, but she wanted him to be a little more useful before that happened. He replied that he was glad he had refused the Bloodsucker's recruitment offer. He had absolutely no intention of becoming the companion of someone like her. Medu promised to treat him better than the rest of the trash in that hideout. According to her, even after Gray Lee was defeated, his body could still be useful for something. She even offered him a chance to join the group, saying she would convince the higher-ups to turn him into an elite bodyguard as well. Gray Lee noticed that the mage was deliberately leaving several openings. It was obvious she was trying to lure him into attacking, so it could only be a trap. With his speed, he might be able to end the confrontation before she even had time to react. At the same time, he hesitated. Against a mage, closing the distance normally created the perfect opportunity to attack, at least in theory. However, Gray Lee knew he could not fight an elite bodyguard by relying on logic alone. His instincts screamed at him not to touch that woman under any circumstances. There was something about her that gave him an extremely ominous feeling. Medu said that someone with his level of skill should already have realized that he could not defeat her. With instincts that sharp, Gray Lee would be perfect for joining the Bloodsuckers. Gray Lee replied that he had another answer in mind for that proposal. In the next instant, he threw a knife directly at the mage's face. The impact caused the surface of her face to crack apart like porcelain. However, Medu quickly reconstructed her own face using the power of shadows, exactly as Varian did. Then everything returned to normal, and Gray Lee realized that she was not the real mage. That explained why her presence had seemed so artificial. Soon, several more copies of the mage appeared and surrounded Gray Lee inside the enormous hall. She finally understood that Gray Lee possessed enough strength to defeat her, as long as he could reach her true body. Even though he had a perfect opportunity to catch her by surprise, Gray Lee chose to throw a small weapon instead. It was a low-risk move to test the situation before committing himself. She wondered whether he was truly that intelligent. Gray Lee had probably understood the situation quite some time ago. If he had not been holding some trump card in reserve, reserve, he certainly would have risked a counterattack even during that brief opening. Gray Lee would have wagered everything. Missing the chance to surprise her mattered less than using that move to assess the battlefield. Gray Lee found it irritating to deal with so many decoys. With his trump card, he could face enemies far stronger than himself and probably end the fight with a single strike from the Shadow Blade. However, the backlash made that technique nearly self-destructive. He needed to be certain of the finishing blow, since using that power against a mere illusion would be an enormous waste. This was practically the worst possible matchup for Gray Lee, especially if the mage was deliberately using the decoys that way. Her strategy was truly effective, as it neutralized the one major trump card Gray Lee possessed. Medu asked whether he intended to eliminate all the illusions at once. To her, such an attempt would be pointless. That was because several new copies continued appearing around him, and Gray Lee still could not identify which one was real. They all began firing bursts of flame. Even the illusions could cast magic, although their attacks were relatively weak. After all, the spells produced by the clones had far less power. Medu's true objective seemed to be something else. She probably wanted to prolong the fight until Gray Lee ran out of energy. Then she could finish him off from a distance while preventing him from getting close. It was a classic tactic used by mages against swordsmen. However, since that strategy was not producing the expected result, all of Medu's copies combined their strength and launched a massive rock at Gray Lee. The gigantic stone shattered violently when it struck the area. Fragments struck Gray Lee and left several superficial wounds, while also temporarily blocking his vision. With no other choice, he retreated and took cover behind one of the hall's pillars. Even so, the magical stones continued pursuing him until Gray Lee encountered another copy along the way. The clone did not merely launch a fireball, but also summoned shadowy hands to restrain him. At that moment, Gray Lee once again felt that he needed to become one with his sword. He enveloped his own body and the blade in that dark aura. Then he charged directly through the figure that appeared to be the mage. His momentum was so intense that he ended up destroying part of the hall's wall. In the process, Gray Lee struck Medu decisively. She could not understand how he had reached such speed or how he had discovered her true position. Gray Lee, however, had suspected from the beginning that her true body was not mixed in among the clones. If Medu could create so many decoys, it made no sense to hide the original among them. The real question was finding where she was. The answer came thanks to the magic of the shadowy hands. Gray Lee sensed vibrations behind the wall and located the real Medu. Soon afterward, however, his body began suffering the severe backlash from the technique. A serious wound appeared on his right arm, greatly impairing his movements. Gray Lee improvised a bandage with a piece of his own shirt and tightened the knot with his teeth. When some criminals noticed that he was sitting on the floor, injured and trying to regain his strength after the previous confrontation, they seized the opportunity and tried to attack him while he appeared vulnerable. Gray Lee, however, reacted using only his left arm. Criminals of that level would not be enough to bring him down easily. Even badly injured and covered in signs of battle, he could still fight. Therefore, the confrontation was still far from over, even with Gray Lee in that condition. Meanwhile, Leonhardt was not facing much difficulty in his own area, but he eventually began to feel somewhat uneasy. A loud sound coming from Gray Lee's sector caught his attention. Leonhardt immediately realized that it did not sound like an ordinary fight. He suspected that Gray Lee might be facing the criminal classified as a special designation target. Leonhardt started running in that direction, but stopped halfway after thinking that his help might be useless. After all, when Gray Lee fought seriously, his strength was far beyond Leonhardt's. Even if there were 100 Leonhardts together, they probably still could not defeat Gray Lee. Therefore, if there were an opponent too powerful even for Gray Lee to face alone, Leonhardt's presence would hardly change anything. If he tried to save him without enough power, he would probably only end up putting himself in danger as well. So Leonhardt decided to search for medicine for Gray Lee and resumed his mission, believing that his companion would be capable of defeating that opponent. In reality, however, Gray Lee could barely deal with an ordinary criminal whom he would have defeated almost instantly before facing Medu. Now, even the slightest movements required effort. His body was weakened and his right arm barely responded, but he continued gripping his sword. One of the bloodsuckers asked in alarm whether that meant Medu had truly been defeated. Another replied that it was impossible. To him, there was no way a swordsman in that condition could have defeated Medu. However, another bloodsucker reported that they had found her body in the next room, defeated by a single sword strike. That confirmed that the boy possessed enough strength to defeat Medu. Therefore, even while injured, he remained extremely dangerous. The criminals began discussing whether they should call a mage, as they were too wary to approach Gray Lee directly. The problem was that the mages gathered to eliminate the intruder had disappeared. Everything indicated that Gray Lee had already defeated all of them. Faced with that, one of the bloodsuckers ordered the ordinary men to retreat, saying that they would only get in the way during the confrontation. With tremendous difficulty, Gray Lee managed to stand by using his own sword for support. Shortly afterward, however, he fell back to his knees. His body was still far from returning to normal. For now, the best option was to remain on his knees and keep a steady posture so he would not lose his balance. The bloodsucker criminal could not tell whether Gray Lee was pretending he could not stand or had truly reached his limit. Either way, he decided to take advantage of the opening and rushed forward with a strike. However, his sword was deflected by Gray Lee's blade, completely breaking his stance. Gray Lee immediately seized the opportunity and countered with an attack aimed at the abdomen. However, the strike was blocked by hidden protection, a coat of chain mail worn beneath the criminal's clothes. Gray Lee realized that his right hand had grown so weak that his sword could not even pierce ordinary chain mail. Even so, simply being alive already felt like a miracle, so he would not complain. The criminal leading the others declared that he had finally figured out how to defeat that boy and would deal with him personally. The attacks that followed came too quickly for Gray Lee, weakened as he was, to keep track of every movement. It was only natural that he was being pressured now because the enemies had clearly realized that his strength was running out. Gray Lee could still endure and defend himself, but he knew very well that his energy would not last forever. If this continued, his defeat would only be a matter of time. Using the shadow power again would be far too dangerous, so he had to fight using only the resources he still had. As he blocked another strike from the bloodsucker criminal, Gray Lee decided to resort to one final option. He gathered and channeled the remaining life force within his own body. With that power, he managed to deliver a decisive strike and bring down the criminal before him. It was the first time Gray Lee had used life force in a real battle. Even after being completely defeated, the man still managed to call Gray Lee a monster before losing his strength. When the others realized that their companion had fallen, they immediately retreated, convinced that Gray Lee had never truly been weakened. Gray Lee knew that his condition was exactly that bad, but he found it convenient to let the enemies believe otherwise. Using life force exacted a heavy toll on his weakened body. His circulation was poor, his breath was fading, and every breath grew increasingly labored. The criminals then decided to retreat, seek reinforcements, and reorganize their attack. That unexpected retreat gave Gray Lee a few precious moments to try to recover his strength. He tried to assess his condition and determine what advantages he could still make use of, but his body barely responded. Gray Lee nearly lost consciousness, and his vision began to grow increasingly blurred. They had said that he could return to the academy as soon as he completed the mission, but at that moment that seemed very far away. Gray Lee did not even know whether he could hold out until then. The sounds of battle were coming from far away, so he could not count on reinforcements arriving anytime soon. If Pong were still alive, he should be somewhere nearby. However, the complete lack of movement indicated that he truly was dead. Gray Lee tried to recover some of his energy, but the criminals' reinforcements returned. This time, they seemed ready to try a different strategy. Gray Lee did not know exactly what they were planning after witnessing his life force soared. The enemies had probably realized that a direct confrontation would put them at a disadvantage, so they must have been preparing a surprise attack. However, after carefully observing the leech's formation, he realized that none of them intended to advance. That indicated they were waiting for someone to arrive while watching Gray Lee steadily lose more energy. He would rather the leeches simply charge forward and try to finish this. Waiting like this was even more agonizing than being forced to fight. Eventually, one of the criminals finally realized that Gray Lee really was weakened. Gray Lee remained silent, thinking that was probably the best choice. The criminals continued taunting him, claiming that the boy could no longer even move. Before, none of them would have stood a chance against Gray Lee, but in his current condition, things were different. He was at his limit now, since the enemies he had fought earlier had at least managed to drain a considerable amount of his energy. So they decided to return to Plan A. All the leeches charged forward at once. Gray Lee could not even raise his sword with his right arm. He was completely debilitated, and his tendon was no longer responding properly. And just when it seemed there was no way out, Leonhardt appeared despite his own injuries and quickly drove away all the criminals surrounding him. After all, he was considered the best first-year student. He apologized to Gray Lee for taking so long, explaining that he had gone to find some good medicine. It was a magical healing potion. Leonhardt had not forgotten the promise he had made to Gray Lee. When he finally managed to drink the potion, Gray Lee sincerely thanked him. Leonhardt had arrived at exactly the right moment. Leonhardt replied that they were actually the ones who had been saved. Even against hundreds of criminals, he normally should not have suffered so much as a scratch. The only reason he was injured was because he had fought a specially designated criminal. Gray Lee explained that he had somehow managed to defeat his opponent. However, after using that power, the side effect had left him almost completely unable to continue. If Leonhardt had not arrived at that moment, the confrontation probably would have ended with both sides completely defeated. Leonhardt was relieved to have arrived in time, but remarked that they were near Senior Pong's post. When he asked whether Gray Lee had abandoned him, he received a negative answer. Pong was probably already dead. From the looks of it, the mage Gray Lee had fought had defeated Pong first. Perhaps they could have saved him if they had stayed together, but she had chosen to act that way. Leonhardt had also managed to bring 3 bottles of healing potion. There were many more available, but since he was in a hurry, he had only taken those. Gray Lee then suggested that Leonhardt drink one of the potions as well. Leonhardt believed his injuries were not that serious, but after taking a closer look, he realized he was more badly injured than he had thought. In his haste, he had not even noticed. He had probably been injured along the way while bringing the potion to Gray Lee. When someone is completely focused, they barely notice the pain. As soon as Leonhardt became aware of his injuries, they started bothering him. Even so, he considered waiting before drinking it. He could save the potion for a more serious situation. He handed 2 potions to Gray Lee, but the boy insisted that Leonhardt should drink one of them. Faced with that insistence, Leonhardt finally agreed and drank the potion. Now that they were both feeling much better, Gray Lee remarked that he had never imagined their injuries would disappear so easily. That that potion was far more powerful than those available at the academy. Leonhardt was also impressed as he watched the injuries disappear. When he first encountered a magical potion as a child, he had reacted exactly the same way. Gray Lee asked whether Leonhardt had needed to drink a potion as a child because of some serious injury. He explained that they were merely injuries from swordsmanship training, nothing truly serious. They made him drink potions so he could quickly return to training. Gray Lee concluded that the man's family must be incredibly wealthy to waste potions on minor injuries. In any case, Leonhardt asked what their next move would be. Gray Lee replied that their priority was to reunite with Lono and find a way back to the academy. According to the information he had gathered, there had been only one specially designated enemy whom he had already defeated. Besides that, there were probably few opponents left. The mission was practically complete. After the mage's defeat, it was highly likely that the enemies were preparing to fight under unfavorable conditions. In other words, they were probably searching for Lu, so they should not encounter many ambushes or traps along the way. Leonhardt admitted that he lacked enough experience to assess the situation, so he asked for Gray Lee's opinion. Gray Lee asked whether he had also noticed during the battle that the number of enemies had suddenly decreased. Leonhardt confirmed it. From a certain point onward, it had seemed as though the enemies had simply vanished. Gray Lee explained that they were clearly concentrating their forces in one location and preparing some kind of weapon. Unless they were fools, the enemies would never choose an obvious location. They would certainly gather their forces to set up an ambush somewhere difficult to notice. That way, they would try to overwhelm them with superior numbers. There was another problem as well. Those enemies belonged to a criminal syndicate responsible for countless deaths. They also showed no concern for their own allies. Therefore, they might resort to massive explosions or even spread poison, despite knowing that their companions would be caught in it as well. The leeches showed no mercy, so there were many possibilities to consider. Gray Lee knew that delivering the final blow to a cornered syndicate would be difficult, especially now that they had nothing left to lose. Leonhardt then asked how they intended to deal with that situation. After all, no one at the academy had taught them how to deal with enemies who simply could not be defeated with a sword. Gray Lee replied that it was simple. They only needed to locate the user responsible and neutralize him. Even so, he knew perfectly well that finding that user was precisely the hardest part. In the world before the regression, the Purger worshippers frequently attacked the subjugation squad. Because of that, its members received some training in dealing with criminal organizations. Gray Lee, however, had never received specialized infiltration training. Because of that, even he did not know how far his knowledge could take them. He told Leonhardt that he had some experience dealing with criminal organizations, but preferred to keep the details hidden and revealed only what was necessary. Dealing with an organization like the Bloodsucker, which no longer cared about keeping up appearances, was far more complicated. As they approached veteran Luinol's post, Gray Lee moved ahead with Leonhardt, both advancing silently. He then made one of the signals he had taught Leonhardt, indicating that he should stop and remain alert. Right afterward, he signaled for him to prepare for an emergency evacuation. Leonhardt knew he could never forget Gray Lee's teachings. Because of that, he had memorized every one of those signals. To Leonhardt, it looked like an ordinary passageway, but Gray Lee noticed a trap. And sure enough, after they advanced a few steps, farther ahead, a massive explosion was triggered. Even so, they managed to escape at the last moment. Since Leonhardt was already prepared thanks to the evacuation signal, he and Gray Lee raced down the corridor without wasting a second. The two ran to escape the rubble of the base as it collapsed after the powerful explosion. When they finally reached safety, Leonhardt asked how Gray Lee had noticed the trap. Gray Lee simply replied that he had smelled something. He recognized that scent. It was the same one he had smelled when a bridge used by his subjugation squad in his previous life had been destroyed with explosives. Those responsible were probably using similar materials. Perhaps it was gunpowder or something similar. After all, even the smell of explosives could vary depending on how they were made and the organization using them. Even so, he recognized the same scent associated with the Purgers. This raised the possibility that, in his previous life, the Bloodsucker had some connection to them. At that moment, the criminals went to inspect the wreckage and search for the academy students. However, when they looked toward the end of the corridor, they realized the two were still alive. Gray Lee then gave the signal to advance against the enemies. Leonhardt had been waiting for exactly that. Leonhardt charged forward and quickly took down several opponents while Gray Lee guarded his back. The two fought back to back. Leonhardt, who was deeply fond of Gray Lee, became even more impressed by their partnership. Gray Lee's right arm was still aching, preventing him from using his full strength. However, the simple fact that he could still move it was enough, especially while fighting alongside Leonhardt. Gray Lee did not need to face everyone alone, and the two of them were already enough to overcome the squad that had tried to eliminate them with explosives. Their opponents had to admit that it had been a good strategy. The problem was that Gray Lee was among them. Because of that, they had no chance of winning. Gray Lee warned Leonhardt not to talk too much with the enemy, since he might reveal unnecessary information. Leonhardt acknowledged his mistake and apologized. Gray Lee, however, replied that the information would make no difference if no enemy remained to pass it on. While you are here, go ahead and leave a like on the video. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and join the channel's Discord so you never miss a video. Updates are announced both here and on our server. You can also check out the channel membership and support this major production that you all follow and enjoy so much. Just checking quickly. You already left a like and subscribed, right? Let me look at your screen. Hold on, man. What is that incognito tab you have open? Anyway, everything is fine. Let's get back to the video. After that, they continued advancing without much difficulty. There were no more traps, ambushes, or explosives, only direct clashes with swords. In a sword duel, those criminals simply had no chance against Gray Lee and Leonhardt. When Gray Lee faced the first enemy carrying a shield and swung his sword, he intended only to break through the defense. To his surprise, he ended up shattering the shield itself. He should not have recovered so much strength from using only a magic potion. Perhaps that organization's potions contained some unusual ingredient. Gray Lee only hoped he would not suffer any side effects afterward. Until then, however, they would continue neutralizing every opponent. Leonhardt, consumed by anger, took down an enemy who tried to attack Gray Lee from his blind spot. After that, only a few opponents remained. One of the bloodsucker criminals tried to flee and call for reinforcements, but he was quickly stopped by Luinel. The two were relieved to see that Luinel was all right. Louis Nassau apologized for the delay in bringing reinforcements, explaining that he had encountered far more enemies than expected. His next strike was so powerful that, besides knocking down the criminals, it also destroyed some of their equipment. Luinel truly fought with brute force. He had not encountered any particularly powerful opponents, but he had been forced to face an enormous number of them. Along the way, however, he found Palm's body and clear signs that a battle had taken place there. Gray Lee then confirmed that Palm truly had not survived. Luinel explained that Palm's condition was extremely strange. It clearly did not seem to be the result of ordinary magic or swordsmanship, but rather some kind of biological magic that indicated the presence of a specially designated criminal. According to an enemy they had interrogated, Meduvarian was there. Luinel did not believe he could defeat someone capable of taking down veteran Palm, so he decided to prioritize reuniting with his companions. He then asked whether there was any information about Medu, such as her fighting style or possible weaknesses. Gray Lee replied that, if they really were talking about her, then he had already defeated her. Louis approached and placed a hand on his shoulder, saying that he had even considered that possibility. Even so, he was surprised that Gray Lee had actually managed it. Gray Lee merely replied that he needed to organize the information better. Meanwhile, Leonhardt was bothered by seeing Luinel touch him when he himself could not do the same. They reached an empty corridor and spread the maps across the floor to mark the areas. Gray Lee had defeated Medu at that location and eliminated the nearby enemies, while Luinel had dealt with the remaining opponents in that region. Luinel, however, had left a considerable area unchecked, since he had spent much of his time running from one place to another. He admitted that if he had encountered Medu along the way, he probably would not have survived. In the end, Gray Lee had saved his life. Luinel observed that, if the map was correct, they had practically taken control of the entire facility. The only question was how they would get back once everything was over. Gray Lee explained that the Academy had promised to help them return, although it had not provided any specific instructions. He had barely finished speaking when poisonous gas began spreading through the corridor. It was an emergency purification procedure, triggered after regular communications with the bloodsucker base were interrupted. Realizing the danger, the knights immediately held their breath. Luinel then broke through one of the walls to open an escape route. He then told everyone to hold their breath for as long as possible and run. He charged forward, smashing through the walls in his path like an excavator. Before he could trigger another trap, Gray Lee grabbed his clothes and pulled him back, keeping him from being caught in the flames of an explosion that nearly reached Luinel. They kept forcing their way through as they ran, trying to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the spot where the poisonous gas had been released. Gray Lee warned everyone to remain alert, as there could be other poisonous gas traps scattered throughout the area. Luinel was no longer leading the way, so he simply advised everyone to maintain a safe distance from one another. The group continued breaking through walls, avoiding explosions and dodging debris along the way, until, at one point, Luinel smashed through another wall and ended up taking a deep breath of poisonous gas. He suddenly stopped. His body reacted to the poison, causing his veins to bulge noticeably. Gray Lee knew that even before his regression, there had never been a gas capable of killing someone instantly after only a small inhalation. However, Luinel apparently was no longer in any condition to continue fighting. Leonhardt also lacked the strength to break through that wall. Even so, he focused himself and prepared to draw upon as much of his life force as possible. Regardless of the consequences, he did not care if his body ended up weakened. After all, Gray Lee was the greatest asset on that team. And Leonhardt was not thinking only about the shadow ability Gray Lee had used against Diablo. Even during confrontations with criminal organizations, Gray Lee had already demonstrated his capabilities. It was obvious that he possessed knowledge, experience, tremendous energy, and excellent tactical instincts. For that reason, Leonhardt was willing to risk his own body by using as much of his life force as possible. He needed to clear a path, since Luinel could no longer do so because of the poisonous gas. The effort left him completely exhausted. tested. He did not possess the same physical endurance as his senior. In the end, Gray Lee also drew upon his life force to break through the remaining walls. Both Luinol and Leonhardt were severely weakened by the effects of the poisonous gas. Gray Lee was the only one of the three who could still move normally. Finally, he managed to break through the last wall. The three of them had managed to escape the leech's base. As soon as they made it outside, the other two collapsed to their knees. Gray Lee then helped his two companions keep moving forward. Despite the tremendous difficulty, he began carrying them both. His eyes began to burn from the gas, which was also spreading through the forest outside. Even with his eyes burning, Gray Lee knew he had to keep them open. Otherwise, none of the three would make it out of there. There was no other choice. He had to breathe the contaminated air to have enough strength to carry his two companions out of the forest. After tremendous effort, they finally left the forest and reached a more open clearing. That was when he realized they had only 2 healing potions, even though all 3 of them were injured. Shortly afterward, 2 magical doors appeared behind him. Several people emerged through the doors, but Gray Lee could not make out exactly who they were. His vision was blurry, as the effects of the poisonous gas had left him extremely dizzy. At the front stood the hooded woman, the Star Reader's messenger, recognizable by her striking lipstick. She remarked that it was good to have more survivors, since on other occasions the number had fallen below expectations. Gray Lee wondered if they had expected only 1 survivor. If that were true, it meant 2 of them were supposed to have fallen along the way. The messenger praised their performance and announced the end of the special training. They could now use teleportation magic to return to the academy, starting with those who could still walk on their own. Before leaving, Gray Lee wanted to at least give each companion a healing potion, since all 3 of them had inhaled the poisonous gas. The messenger told him not to worry. A squad specializing in healing magic was waiting for them at the academy, offering treatment far safer and more effective than ordinary potions. Leonhardt and Luinol were placed on stretchers and carried by the other hooded figures. As soon as they reached the academy, they received treatment. Ariel immediately recognized the effects of poisonous gas and ordered the healing squad to use internal healing magic on all of them. Their lungs had been damaged, but after the treatment, all 3 were finally able to breathe deeply again. Rafa Elixir was disappointed to see her squad concentrating all their magic on the 2 unconscious men. In fact, Gray Lee was the one with the most severe lung damage. That had happened because he was forced to breathe deeply while carrying them through the forest filled with poisonous gas. Rafa treated Gray Lee so effectively that the pain in his lungs quickly disappeared. Suddenly, he felt perfectly fine again. At that moment, he acknowledged that this truly was Rafa's ability. After all, she was the one who had regenerated his arm after it was damaged by the shadows when he pushed the ability too far while using his life force. The squad apologized to their professor. Since Gray Lee had remained standing on his own, everyone had assumed his injuries were the least severe. Rafa reprimanded them, saying that future healing magic specialists should never jump to conclusions. Before any treatment, a proper diagnosis had to be performed. Even so, she looked at Gray Lee and admitted that hardly anyone could remain standing in such a condition. Because of that, it was understandable that the squad had made the wrong assumption. Ariel then asked why he had done something so reckless, making it obvious how worried she was. He simply explained that he had carried 2 people through an area filled with gas. To maintain his strength and keep moving, he had no choice but to breathe deeply. Ariel asked Rafa whether it was truly possible for someone to survive after going through something like that. Rafa replied that it was, after all, he was standing right in front of them. His body had naturally tried to reject the poisonous gas and expel it. With Gray Lee's exceptional willpower, it was not entirely impossible. Even so, it was astonishing that he had managed it immediately after confronting a criminal organization. Ariel said she did not know Gray Lee's past, so she could not say anything for certain. Even so, she believed he must have endured many hardships. Gray Lee thought she was right. He had indeed undergone intense training, but all of that happened before his regression. However, he could not tell anyone about it since he doubted anyone would believe such a story. Ariel explained that the Star Reader's messengers had said that after the 4 students departed, only 1 would survive the training. That had been the prediction. Rafa remarked that, knowing the reader, they probably expected only Gray Lee to return. What they had not expected was to see him cross the poisonous gas while carrying 2 other people. Ariel replied that, even so, the whole thing was still completely insane. After all, they had organized training for students based on the assumption that only 1 of them would return alive. The messenger asked Ariel whether there had been any positive results. Since the number of survivors had changed, it was natural to assume that the progress and outcome of the training would also be different. At that moment, however, Ariel stopped the messenger. She asked whether the messenger was concerned only with the outcome of a single person. The woman replied that no deaths had been confirmed, and that an internal investigation would soon be conducted. She added that Ariel only needed to report the changes in the boy's power, as that was a direct order from Central Command. Ariel made her report right there. With her divine eye, she could tell that Gray Lee had grown far stronger than expected after only a single day of training. Gray Lee himself, however, noticed no improvement. To him, his power remained practically the same as before. Even his vital force swordsmanship felt exactly the same as what he had always practiced. Ariel explained that he had probably used the vital force sword under extreme circumstances. In real combat that usually only happens when someone reaches a point where they accept the possibility of death. It was a kind of growth that was difficult to notice during peaceful times. However, when body and mind are pushed to their limits, some growth inevitably occurs. When Gray Lee once again reaches the boundary between life and death, he will understand what Ariel meant. The messenger replied that she would relay those words to Central Command. As for the Star Reader, his wish had been fulfilled. The next morning, the students were already back in class at the academy. My God, these people really do not get a single moment to rest. They had just returned from an extremely dangerous mission, yet they were already facing another swordsmanship training session. As always, students would be paired with others of similar skill levels. Surprisingly, the professor showed concern for Leonhardt Hart and Gray Lee and asked whether they were fit to train. Gray Lee explained that the lingering effects of the poisonous gas had already been treated with recovery magic. Leonhardt added that Professor Ariel had also confirmed that they were both healthy. Relieved to see them back safely, the professor ordered the class to begin training. Just as Gray Lee had expected, his partner would once again be Leonhardt. Leonhardt replied that it was obvious, after all, he was the only partner capable of matching Gray Lee. The professor admitted that, unfortunately, it was true. The gap between Gray Lee, Leonhardt, and the other first-year students was already enormous. He asked them to endure it a little longer since they always ended up being paired together. Perhaps during joint training with another academy building, they could find new partners. Leonhardt said he preferred it that way. Even though he always fought Gray Lee, he discovered something new in every match. Gray Lee agreed, since facing the same opponent also allowed him to explore different ways of fighting. The professor replied that he now understood why the two of them were improving so quickly. With that mindset, they would certainly go far. The match between Leonhardt and Gray Lee soon became the center of attention, and everyone stopped to watch. Before they began, Leonhardt asked if he could use his vital force. Gray Lee replied that he could. After all, that was precisely why they had been given real swords for that training session. Leonhardt still had little experience in real combat, but he surpassed Gray Lee physically. Furthermore, he came from a prestigious family, possessed abundant vital force, and had gained some experience during the special training. Gray Lee did not know how much longer he could keep pace with Leonhardt at this rate. From the very first moment, Leonhardt unleashed his vital force at maximum power. Then came the first attack, whose sheer force Gray Lee had fortunately forgotten. The strike was powerful enough to crack the ground. Even with a blunt training sword, the force he displayed was impressive. At first, Gray Lee chose simply to defend against the attacks and evade them. However, Gray Lee noticed that his sword felt strangely light. As a result, his movements were much faster. Then, when he counterattacked with the intention of disarming Leonhardt, he ended up sending the young man flying far away. Leonhardt still managed to land on his knees, bracing himself with his sword to maintain his balance. The surrounding students were impressed when they realized that Leonhardt had emerged unharmed from that blow. The reflexes of those two were truly on another level. But what was even more frightening was realizing that Gray Lee had managed to send Leonhardt flying like that. The professor immediately rushed over to Leonhardt and asked if he was all right. Leonhardt confirmed that he was fine, but he clearly realized the difference in strength between them. He then asked whether Gray Lee had been holding back all this time. Gray Lee replied that of course he had not. If he had known he possessed such strength, he certainly would have used it before. Leonhardt then considered the possibility that it was a consequence of the growth Gray Lee had achieved during the special training. Even the professor found that explanation strange. Even assuming it was the result of that training, he could not understand where such tremendous power had come from. That attack had not even used vital force. To the professor, the numbers simply did not add up, especially because Leonhardt had just fought using his vital force sword. Even so, Leonhardt could not withstand it and was sent flying, despite being equipped with an ordinary vital force sword. After all, recovering the energy consumed by vital force takes some time. The professor then asked how much vital force would be required to repeatedly unleash power at that level. If that strength depended solely on Gray Lee's vital energy, he probably would have collapsed immediately after swinging his sword. Gray Lee realized that made sense. He had attacked with tremendous force, yet he felt no sign of fatigue. At most, it felt as though he had used an ordinary vital force sword only once. Even Gray Lee himself had not noticed exactly when it happened. The professor decided to stop the training for the time being and call Professor Ariel. To clarify the situation, her special eyes would be indispensable. Shortly before that class, Ariel had asked the professor to notify her if anything happened to Gray Lee. That was why he immediately thought of her, and now we understand the reason. And that is all for today, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and check out the membership club to support our videos. Comment with your favorite moment. Take care, and see you next time.